Somewhere in the long summers of a certain memory, there is a small house in the mountain folds of rural Japan, and around it, always, the sound of summer insects rising and falling like something slow and half asleep. Some stories find us in quiet places, and this one, which has been told in murmured voices, in late nights and low lamplight, begins with a boy who was, at the time, still very young. His name was Kei, and he was in his early teenage years, a middle school student, and he loved his grandparents' village the way children love places that feel safe and unhurried and separate from the ordinary difficulties of life. Every summer, the long train ride would carry him from the city into the green and the quiet, and his grandparents would be waiting with cold mujicha, barley tea, and the comfortable smell of the old wooden house settled warmly into its own age. The fields around the village were full of summer light, and the world felt, in those hours after arrival, as though nothing in it could be wrong. Kei had visited this village many times before, and yet this particular summer, the summer that this story belongs to, had something different about it from the very first afternoon, a quality he could not have named then and perhaps still cannot name now. The village itself was small, as those old mountain communities tended to be, a few dozen households, a shrine up the hillside, rice paddies laid in their careful squares, narrow roads connecting one place to another through the heat. His grandparents' house sat at the edge of the settlement, with a low stone wall on one side and a stand of old cedar trees on another, and the open fields beyond that ran on until the light gave out at the distant tree line. That first afternoon, he unpacked his things in the upstairs room always kept for him, the one with the single window looking out toward the fields, and listened to his grandmother moving through the kitchen below. The smell of rice and miso rose through the old floorboards, and the summer heat leaned against the wooden walls, and a small fan turned slowly in the corner, and for a while everything felt precisely as it always had. It was toward early evening, when the light outside had softened from gold to something dimmer and less certain, that Kei first heard the sound coming from somewhere beyond the garden wall. It was low and slow and almost like laughter, but quieter than laughter, more like the sound a voice makes when it has forgotten it is being heard, cycling through the warm evening air without urgency, without pattern. He would describe it later as something like the syllable po, repeated softly 3 times at gentle intervals, a sound without insistence, the way water drips from a roof long after the rain has already ended and moved on. Curious, the way a boy of that age is curious, he went to the window and looked down into the garden, and then beyond the low garden wall to the narrow path that ran along the outside of the property. What he saw there is the part of this story that he would return to carefully, quietly, for many years afterward, not with dramatic insistence, not with the urgency of someone seeking to convince, but with the slow and steady wonder of someone who encountered something that still, even now, does not yield entirely to explanation. Standing on the path, on the far side of the garden hedge, was a figure, a woman, or the shape of a woman, wearing a white dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat of the kind used during fieldwork to keep the summer sun from one's face. There was nothing unusual about the clothing itself, nothing in the cut of the dress or the weave of the hat that would have drawn attention, and yet the figure wearing those ordinary things was very, very tall. The term in Japanese for the measurement is hachishaku, 8 shaku, a unit from the old system of lengths, which works out, by modern reckoning, to something approaching 2.5 meters, taller than any doorway in the old house behind him. The hat brim covered whatever face was beneath it, and the white dress reached nearly to the ground, and the figure stood with perfect stillness on the far side of the hedge, and that low soft sound continued from somewhere near it. Kay watched for a moment from the window, not frightened yet, only puzzled, the way a person is puzzled by something that does not fit any of the categories they have been taught to hold. He went downstairs without hurrying and found his grandfather in the main room and mentioned, in the offhand way of children who are not yet sure if something is worth mentioning, that there was a very tall woman standing outside along the garden wall. His grandfather's response was not what Kay expected. There was no gentle dismissal, no comfortable adult explanation, no reassuring observation that tall women exist and the world is generally ordinary and well accounted for. Instead, his grandfather's face went quiet and still in a way that Kay had never seen it do before, and then the old man rose from where he was sitting with a deliberate steadiness and said something very low to Kay's grandmother, who immediately left the room. What passed between them in the kitchen Kay could not hear, but he felt the shift in the house the way you feel the air change before weather arrives, a kind of internal rearrangement, a quiet bracing. His grandfather came back and guided Kay toward the staircase, one hand firm and calm at his back, and told him to go to his room and to stay there, and above all not to open the door for any voice that called to him through it. The instructions were quiet and precise, delivered without panic, without extended explanation, in the steady tone of someone applying a protocol that has been carried for a long time, the way an older person sometimes knows exactly what to do in a situation that a younger one has never faced. Kay went upstairs and sat in his room, and from below came the sounds of the house being prepared, windows being drawn closed one by one, something being poured carefully along the sills, paper being placed and pressed at door frames. He would understand later that what his grandfather had been spreading along every window ledge was salt, and that the paper at the frames was ofuda, talismans, blessing slips, part of an old household practice that persists in certain parts of rural Japan for exactly this kind of moment. From the window, he could still see the pale shape on the far side of the hedge, perfectly still now in the deepening blue of early evening, the hat unchanged, the dress unchanged, patient in the way that something very old tends to be patient. Night came the way it does in those mountain places, gradually, then fully, the darkness not arriving in a rush but moving through the sky in slow degrees, one shade of blue giving way to the next until the stars appeared above the cedars. Kay stayed in his room as he had been told, sitting on the futon laid out for him, listening to the insects outside reach their highest pitch of the evening, which felt in some ways like a kind of quiet company against the stillness. His grandparents brought him dinner on a tray, and his grandmother's face, when she opened the door just enough to pass it through, was warm and composed and careful in the particular way of people who are managing something difficult with love. She told him, quietly, that everything was being handled, that he should eat and try to rest, that the adults were doing what needed to be done, and he would remember the steadiness of her voice in that moment for a very long time afterward. He ate in the lamplight of his room, and the summer heat settled around the old wooden walls, and the insects went on with their long unbroken song, and for a while it was almost possible to believe that the evening was simply an evening. It was later, much later, after the insects had quieted and the village had gone dark and still, that a soft knocking came at the door of his room. Not loud, not insistent, just a measured series of gentle sounds, spaced evenly, the way a considerate visitor might knock if they were uncertain whether the person inside was still awake and did not wish to disturb. And then a voice came through the door, and the voice was his mother's voice, or something that wore his mother's voice the way the figure had worn the white dress, with a careful, impersonal, unhurried accuracy. The voice asked, in his mother's familiar cadence, whether he was awake, whether he had eaten enough, whether he might like to come downstairs for a little while, and the words were exactly the words his mother might choose, in exactly the tone she would use. Kay sat very still on his futon and did not answer, and held his grandfather's instructions close against him, and the silence he kept in that room was one of the more difficult silences of his young life. The knocking came again, and this time the voice was his father's, patient and unhurried, asking if Kay was sleeping, asking if everything was all right, in the particular quiet way his father used to check on him at the end of an evening. There is something particular about hearing a beloved voice say ordinary, gentle things, and knowing, somewhere below thought, in the place where the body stores its oldest understanding, that the voice is not quite right. Kay did not sleep that night, not truly, but lay still with the lamp burning low, and the sounds came and went outside his door at intervals, never insistent, never angry, only continuing, the way that something patient continues. The voice changed again, cycling through, his grandfather's voice now, soft and deliberate, then his mother's once more, moving through the people he loved with the ease of something that had studied them carefully and for a considerable time. What Kay would come to say, when he eventually found words for that night, was not that the voices had been frightening in the ordinary sense, but that they had been wrong in the way a very careful drawing of a familiar face is wrong, recognizable, even precise, and yet somehow absent of the living thing that makes a face a face. Morning arrived the way mornings do, slowly, then completely, the light changing at the edges of the paper screens from grey to pale gold, and with the light came quiet, and the quiet held. Kay heard his grandfather's real footsteps on the stairs, recognizable in a way he could not have explained but felt immediately and without doubt as true, and the door opened and the old man was there, looking tired in the way of someone who has completed a long duty. Downstairs, 3 men that Kay did not recognize were waiting, older men in plain, unremarkable clothing, who spoke quietly with his grandfather in a regional dialect that Kay could not quite follow from across the room. They were from the local shrine, the grandfather explained later, Kanji, which translates most simply as priests, though the word in Japanese carries more weight than that, implies a particular familiarity with things that most people do not need to know. The arrangement the men described was calm and practical. Kay would be driven to an airport in a neighboring prefecture, far enough from the village that the situation, as the priests understood it, would not be able to follow. His grandmother packed a small bag for him while he waited, moving with quiet efficiency, folding his clothes with the careful deliberateness that people employ when they are doing something practical in order to manage something that is not practical at all. She pressed a wrapped rice ball into his hands at the door, and her hands were warm and steady around his, and she looked at him with an expression that held, in equal measure, worry and love and a deep and unshakable confidence. The drive passed through valleys and small towns and long stretches of mountain road, the morning very beautiful in the particular way of rural Japan in summer, green and layered and smelling of warm earth and cedar. One of the priests sat beside Kay in the back seat and said very little, only watched the road and the receding hills with the patient attention of someone performing a duty they understand fully. What the priest did share, in a tone so matter-of-fact that Kay would always remember it for its lack of drama, was something of the nature of what existed in that part of the country, a presence older than the current village, older than most of the names anyone had given to things in that landscape. The locals, the priest observed quietly, had learned over many generations how to live alongside it, the salt, the talismans, the protocols that K's grandfather had followed so precisely, and these things worked, reliably, for those who had grown up knowing them. But for a visitor, for someone young who had encountered the presence without preparation, without the accumulated understanding of that particular place, distance was the simplest and most certain solution, and so distance was what they were providing. He said this without emphasis, in the same calm register one might use to explain a local road condition or a pattern in the mountain weather, and Kay received it in that spirit, as information rather than alarm. 3 days was the window the old knowledge described as significant, and Kay would be well beyond the village long before that, which was what mattered, and the rest would be managed in the way such things had always been managed. The plane carried him back to the city and his ordinary life, his school, his friends, the sounds and smells of his family's apartment, and the summer continued around him in the way that summers do, full of light and ordinary hours. He did not speak of what had happened for a long time, carrying it quietly the way people carry certain things for years before they find the words or the right occasion for them. His grandparents remained in the village, as they always had, and the visits continued in later years, conducted with a different arrangement, a particular care, a slightly different use of rooms and hours, and the positioning of talismans. And every year, as the season of Auburn approached, that late summer period when the old traditions hold that the distance between this world and the other becomes, for a few days, somewhat thinner, an envelope would arrive from his grandfather. Inside were always 4 small slips of paper, covered in careful brushwork that Kay could not read, folded with the precision of someone who had made them many times before, in the same way, for the same purpose. His grandfather never explained them at length, only wrote in his accompanying letter that Kay should keep them somewhere safe, that they were being renewed each year, that everything was being attended to on his behalf. The word he used was migawari, a substitute, a stand-in, the idea being that these paper slips were maintaining something in K's name, absorbing some portion of an old and ongoing arrangement that had been made the summer everything changed. Kay kept them each year, and each year the new ones arrived, and the seasons turned in their ordinary way, and his grandparents aged, and the village continued in the slow and patient manner of such places. The grandmother passed first, in a year Kay remembered for its particular quietness, and then the grandfather some time after, and the house was eventually sold, or left to stand among the cedar trees with the fields going on around it. The last envelope arrived in the summer following his grandfather's passing, 4 talismans written in the familiar hand, folded in the familiar way, and Kay understood that his grandfather had made them in advance, had thought ahead with great care to this. After that, no more envelopes came, and Kay found himself in possession of the last 4 paper slips, their creases grown soft from being unfolded and refolded across many years, carried from one place to another. He kept them still in a drawer, or a small box, somewhere dry where they would not be disturbed, not because he was certain of everything they contained, but because it felt right to maintain, with his own quiet hands, the care that someone else had kept on his behalf for so long. There is a kind of story that does not resolve in the expected way, no final revelation, no definitive accounting of what the tall figure was or what it might have meant if the protocols had not been followed exactly as they were. This story is one of those, and perhaps that is as it should be, given that the village still exists somewhere in those mountains, and the summer insects still rise each year in their familiar rhythm, and certain kinds of old knowledge persist in places where the world has remained, in certain hours, very quiet. Kay carries that summer with him still, not as something to be afraid of, not as a wound, but as a piece of knowledge about the world that most people never have any occasion to acquire, and that he holds with a kind of careful and respectful attention. He has come to feel, over the years, that the thing the priests knew and that his grandfather knew was not only what to do, but how to carry a long, ongoing responsibility with steadiness and love, the way his grandfather folded those slips of paper each year and sent them south to where Kay lived. That act of annual attention, repeated without fail through decades, seems now as important as anything else in this story, the choosing, year after year, to maintain the care, to keep the arrangement, to hold up the old protective attention with both hands. And somewhere in those mountain folds, in the long dusk of summer evenings, the fields go still and the insects settle and the air holds for a moment before the night begins, the way it always has, the way it will. And the paper slips rest in their drawer, quietly patient, keeping whatever it is they were made to keep, in the way that old protective things do when they are honored and not forgotten and tended by someone who understands why they matter. And that, perhaps, is where this first chapter of the story rests tonight, in the drawer, in the August quiet, in the long and gentle fading of the summer light over the fields beyond the hedge. And so we leave that hallway behind, its footsteps fading now into the quiet, like the last echo of a sound you almost imagined. There is no need to hold on to any of it. You can simply let it drift away, the way a candle flame settles after someone gently closes a door. Take a slow breath if you like, in through the nose, and out, long and easy. You are still here, still safe, still warm beneath whatever covers you tonight. Our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, to a place where the walls hold their own kind of memory. But there is no hurry. Rest a moment longer. We will find our way there together, gently, in the dark. Somewhere in the low October light of a weekday afternoon, a young man's telephone rang, and the voice on the other end said, softly and with a kind of quiet certainty, that she was calling from Nagoya station. She had a name. She told him, Mary, and she said it with the unhurried patience of someone who expected to be heard, and perhaps to be believed. He lived in Kanagawa, he mentioned slowly in return, as if this were a detail she might have missed, as if the distance between Nagoya and the coast were something that might reasonably change her mind. She seemed to consider this, and then she said, in measured and gentle syllables, that she was aware of the distance, and that she was coming all the same. Something in the sound of her voice had a quality he would later find himself returning to, not ominous, exactly, but steady and low, the way rain sounds when heard from inside a warm room, present and unhurried and not entirely unwelcome. The legend of Mary had been around for years, the kind of story that moves between friends in school corridors and late-night conversations, the kind that grows in the telling and shrinks a little when the lights come on. She was said to call from a great distance and name her location each time, drawing closer with every call, until at last she was just outside the door, and then just behind, and then the story took whatever turn the teller preferred. The young man set his phone down and made himself some tea, and sat with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to wait and see what happens, which is a different thing entirely from being afraid. When the telephone rang again, she told him she had found a seat in an unreserved carriage on the bullet train, and that this had gone quite well, and that she was now at Shin-Yokohama, which was considerably closer, and she sounded genuinely pleased about this in a quiet way. She asked him, after a brief pause, where one found the subway from there, which direction to walk, which landmark to aim for, and he noticed that the question was earnest and specific, the kind a person asks when they are really trying, when they have written things down and are following their own small system as best they can. He talked her through it, step by patient step, and she listened carefully. He could tell because she repeated back the key points in a murmur, and the pauses between her questions had the quality of someone writing in a small notebook, pressing the pen down to make sure the letters stuck. She got confused somewhere near a large electronics store, she told him, and could not find the right exit, and she described her confusion with such unguarded simplicity that he found it difficult to remain anxious about her proximity. He guided her out, and then she was quiet for a while, and then she called from somewhere else entirely, having taken a wrong turn in the underground, and he guided her out again with the patient precision of someone reading a map for someone who cannot yet read maps. She emerged, finally, from the correct exit, and there was a brief moment in which he could hear the city opening around her, the sound of it, the scale of it, before she composed herself and asked what to do next. He told her which direction to walk, and she walked, and then she got turned around again near a junction where 3 roads met and none of them matched the description, and he was patient about this, and she was patient about this, and eventually she found it. She called from Shonendai, a station in the south of the city, several transfers from where she needed to be, and her voice had a new quality in it, something slightly warmer, because she had worked out the underground system, at least in part, and she wanted him to know. She asked about the Odakyu line next, and which platform, and he told her, and then told her again more slowly because the first time she had written the platform number down wrong, and she thanked him quietly and was gone. He thought, stirring the cold remnant of his tea, that whatever force governed the legend of Mary had perhaps underestimated how thoroughly the Yokohama subway system could humble a person. The afternoon passed in telephone calls and intervals of silence, each call placing her a little closer on the invisible map he was building in his mind, a map made entirely of her voice and her directions and the small sounds of whatever station she was standing in at the time. She reached Futamatagawa and told him so, and he said that from there she could take the express, and she sounded relieved, genuinely relieved, the way a traveler sounds when someone finally tells them the difficult part is nearly done and the rest is only distance. He mentioned, around this time, that he had originally intended to go out that afternoon, and she reminded him, very gently, that she had called that very morning to let him know she was coming, and he could not entirely disagree with this. By the time she reached Yokohama proper, the light outside had shifted to the particular grey-blue the coast takes on when the day is deciding whether to become evening, and the smell of rain was beginning to arrive on the air, faint and cool and full of salt. She was hungry, she admitted softly, and asked if he had a suggestion, and so he thought of the okonomiyaki restaurant in the Sky Building, a place called Yukori, warm and dependable and good, which was exactly what seemed to be called for. He described it to her in some detail, the way the batter sizzled when it first touched the griddle, the particular sweetness of the scallops folded inside, the generous brush of dark sauce across the surface, the importance of eating it while still hot because the warmth was at least half the pleasure, and the smell, he told her, the smell when the batter first hits the iron, which is a smell that is difficult to improve on. She listened to all of this, and he imagined her standing somewhere near the building's entrance, phone held close, memorizing the description the way people do when they are in an unfamiliar city and someone they have come to trust is guiding them somewhere warm. She called again to say she was waiting for her order, and her voice had settled into something he had not quite heard in it before, a quality of ease and presence, the voice of someone who has stopped traveling and started simply being somewhere, which is a different thing. He found himself thinking that this was a considerable improvement over how the afternoon had begun, and he made a second cup of tea, and he sat with it. Across the city, at the stadium near the harbor, the evening baseball game was beginning, the local team in their home whites, and the visitors from Nagoya in theirs, the two cities meeting on the field in the way they sometimes did, without any of the day's complications. She called from outside the stadium, somewhat later, having found her way there and discovered that the ticket windows had already closed for the evening, and she reported this with the quiet resignation of someone who has walked a long way to find a door shut. He told her to look near the large figure at the main entrance, the team mascot, stationed there as it always was, and to look at what might be resting near its feet, and she went quiet for a moment, and then she came back with something new in her voice, soft and wondering, the sound of something small going unexpectedly right. There had been a ticket there, left by an earlier arrival who had gone in already, and she had picked it up with the careful reverence of someone who understood that good fortune should not be treated carelessly. She found her seat in the outer stands as the lights above the field came fully on, the evening sky darkening around them in the way a stadium evening does, all that darkness above and all that brightness below, and the crowd beginning to settle into the shared rhythm of a game. He had already left the stadium by then, the score having gone the wrong way early, and he had walked down toward the waterfront, where the harbor lights were coming on in the new dark and the air smelled of the sea. She called to report on the game, which she was enjoying, and mentioned that the pitcher from Nagoya was performing very well that evening, and he received this information with the equanimity of someone who has fully made his peace with his team's current fortunes. She said, almost as an aside, that she would like to see the large Ferris wheel she could make out from the outer stands, and he told her where it was and how to reach it from the stadium, and she said she would go when the game was done. The October city moved around him as he walked, the evening carrying a coolness that felt clean and good, the harbor smell present in everything, the lights of the buildings doing their slow work of pushing back the dark. She called from the queue for the Ferris wheel sometime later, and her voice was the voice of someone who is happy, though she perhaps could not have said precisely why, only that the evening had turned out very differently from how she had expected it to when the train left Nagoya that morning. There was a small confusion at the ticket counter. She told him a question about her entry that she could not quite follow, and then the staff were smiling and waving her forward, and she did not entirely understand why, only that it seemed to be her turn. She was, as it happened, the 1,000,000th guest of that season, a milestone the staff marked with warmth and some ceremony, presenting her with a box tied in ribbon, which she held on her lap as the gondola began its slow and quiet rise. Inside the box, she found a pair of shoes and a set of autumn clothing, the exact things, she recalled with soft wonder, that she had mentioned wanting earlier in the afternoon, as if the city had somehow been listening to that part of the conversation and had decided to do something about it. The staff invited her to use a dressing room to change, and she came back out into the evening air in the new dress, the October coolness moving pleasantly against the new fabric, the shoes fitting as if they had been chosen with her specifically in mind. From the top of the wheel, she told him, she could see the whole harbor spread out below her, the lights of Yokohama reaching in every direction, the water catching each one and holding it gently, trembling slightly with the movement of the harbor, the city giving its full depth to the dark above it. She said, very quietly, that she had not expected to cry, and that she was not entirely sure why she had, only that the view was very large and she had felt very small, and the two things together had moved something in her that had perhaps not been moved for quite some time. He was somewhere below, walking along the waterfront road, and he listened to this with his free hand in his coat pocket, and he thought he understood it, the way a great height can make all the small difficulties of a long day feel, at last, like they were worth something. There was also a letter in the gift box, she mentioned, an invitation to collect something further at the red brick warehouse along the harbor, and a horse-drawn carriage had been arranged to take her there, which she described in the tone of someone who is no longer entirely sure what category of evening this belongs to. The carriage moved along the waterfront road in the easy manner of something from another century, the harbor on one side and the city drawing quietly back on the other, and she sat very still in the cushioned seat, wearing the autumn dress, the new shoes settled carefully on the floor of the carriage, the harbor smell coming through the open sides. She said it felt like being in a story, and then she paused, and he could hear in the pause that she had realized something about that sentence, and she did not finish the thought aloud, and he did not press her to. At the red brick warehouse, warm and well lit against the surrounding dark, an older man with the unhurried manner of someone long accustomed to the waterfront met her at the entrance and walked her inside, and the evening continued being what it had been slowly becoming, something gentle and unhurried and stranger than she had planned for when she had left home that morning. She stepped back outside after a while and found the harbor open before her, the water moving in its slow and patient way, the lights of ships and distant buildings caught in the surface and held there, doubled and trembling. She called from the water's edge and told him she could see the sea, and that there was a man standing not far away, alone, looking out at the harbor, and that she thought he looked quite romantic standing there in the evening air, which she said softly and without any embarrassment at all. She was speaking, of course, about him, and he knew it as soon as she described the coat and the way the person was standing, and he turned slowly, not in the way one turns when startled, but in the way one turns when something has arrived that one has been expecting without quite knowing it. She was not far behind him, which was exactly where the legend said she would be, and she told him, with considerably more gentleness than the story required, that she was sorry for all the trouble and that she was glad the evening had gone the way it had. He had worked out, several hours earlier, that something about the situation was more human than supernatural, and he had made one quiet phone call to her employer, the organization that ran these particular arrangements, and had spoken with the manager in a measured and friendly way. He had mentioned that one of their people appeared to be attending a baseball game and riding a harbor Ferris wheel rather than her assigned duties, and the manager had listened carefully and then punched her time card without another word, the way someone does when a situation has become self-explanatory. With her time card punched, she was off the clock, and whatever rules governed her role had quietly lifted, and the evening they were now standing in together had become simply an evening, an unusual one, certainly, but an ordinary evening between two people who had spent a long day in the same city without quite being in the same place. She asked why he had stayed, why he had not simply gone somewhere else or left the calls unanswered, and he said, after a moment, that he supposed he had wanted to know how it ended, which was the true answer, and the simplest one. She told him, standing there by the water with the October air around them both, that she had taken this work months earlier because she had been looking for something, though she had not known what, only that her life had felt very small and she had wanted it to grow larger. She admitted, in a voice that was very quiet, that she had not fully understood when she began that meeting people this way always ended the same way, and that she had only come to understand it after she had already grown fond of the work and the people she found through it. She had been afraid all day, she told him, through the subway and the okonomiyaki and the stadium and the wheel, that this evening would end the way the others had, with her alone again on the wrong side of something she could not name. He told her, in the calm way of someone who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion, that he found that arrangement rather sad, and that he did not see why this particular evening had to go that way. She asked about the last train, because the trains had stopped running while she was in the gondola, and the city was very large and she was still quite new to it, and her voice in asking this was small and honest and unguarded. He mentioned, as though it were an ordinary thing he had simply thought to prepare, that there was a hotel nearby, one of the large ones she could see from where they were standing, and that he had arranged a room, which was the last of the evening's small graces. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that came out wrong and had to be corrected, and then corrected again slightly differently, and he didn't mind, and then they stood together by the harbor water a little longer, the city doing its patient work of light and reflection in the surface below. The October rain arrived, just then, softly and without any announcement, the way rain arrives in a harbor city that has long since made its peace with the weather and welcomes it as an old arrangement, and the sound of it on the pavement was gentle and even. They walked, in time, away from the water's edge and toward the warm interior of the hotel, past the red brick walls and the quiet streets that led back into the city, the rain coming down on all of it with the mild and impartial care that rain gives everything equally. She walked carefully in the new shoes, taking small steps where the pavement was wet, and without thinking about it he slowed to match her pace, the way one does when one is walking with someone who is still finding their footing, and they moved together at the pace the evening quietly asked of them. The city settled around them, the way a large city does at the end of a long day, with a gradual and comfortable quieting, the trams finishing their routes, the restaurants drawing their lights down, the harbor moving in its slow perpetual way against the seawall. And later, much later, thinking back on all of it, the calls from Nagoya and Shin-Yokohama and Shonendai, the okonomiyaki eaten hot at the counter, the stadium at nightfall and the ticket resting at the mascot's feet, the gondola rising and the harbor opening below, the carriage along the waterfront road and the dress and the shoes that fit as if they had always been hers, she would understand that this had been a day of small and improbable kindnesses, the accumulating kind that are only visible from a distance, looking back. She would remember standing at the harbor's edge with the city behind her, turning to find that the story had not ended the way stories like hers usually ended, and feeling something ease inside her that she had not known was tight. The rain continued its patient work on the harbor and the pavement and the dark face of the water, and the lights of the city went on reflecting themselves below the surface, each one doubled and trembling slightly in the current. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests for tonight, not with a resolution that explains everything, but with a harbor in the rain, and two people walking slowly toward warmth, and the particular peace that comes when a long and winding day finally finds its way home. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its quiet settle like dust after a long rain, like a door gently closing somewhere deep in the house. There is no hurry here. If you need to breathe, breathe now, slowly, all the way down. Let your shoulders fall. Let the weight of the day press softly into the bed beneath you. Our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, to a small town where the mountains press close and the winters arrive early and stay long. But that story can wait a moment. Right now there is only the dark behind your eyes, and the warmth where you lie, and the sound of your own breathing, even and slow. Somewhere in the season when summer heat begins to soften at the edges of evening, the narrator and her friend B found themselves standing outside the door of AKO's apartment, arms full of convenience store bags and a bottle of something cold that clinked pleasantly against the cans. Several months had passed since AKO had moved in, and in all that time not a single word about the ghost had come from her lips, which had led the narrator to wonder, quietly and without quite admitting it to herself, whether the whole haunted apartment matter had perhaps been an exaggeration on the real estate agent's part. The building was unremarkable in the way that only well-located buildings in central Tokyo can afford to be, neither charming nor run down, simply present, its hallways clean and its elevator humming the small, ordinary hum of elevators everywhere. When AKO opened the door, the apartment inside felt nothing like what the narrator had braced herself for, because instead of the heavy, close air that haunted places are supposed to carry, the room smelled of clean surfaces and something faintly green, the way a room smells when someone has placed a small plant in a corner and forgotten to mention it. AKO was, by nature, the kind of person whose home looked like a photograph in a design magazine, every surface considered, every object earning its place, and the apartment bore this out in every detail she could see. They settled in as friends do, opening the drinks and trading small news about work and mutual acquaintances, the easy conversation of people who have known each other long enough that silence is not uncomfortable and does not need to be filled. The narrator had not forgotten the real estate agent's careful phrasing from months before, the mention of a female presence, the tenants who had not lasted half a year, the rituals that had been tried and found ineffective, but sitting in AKO's warm and pleasant living room with something cold to hold, these things receded quietly to the edges of the evening. It was B who mentioned, after a while, wanting to wash off the day's heat before bed, and AKO said of course the bathroom was available, and that she would fetch them both a change of clothes from the wardrobe room first. The wardrobe room, as the narrator had come to understand, was what AKO called the smaller of the two bedrooms, the one nearest the front door, the room the real estate agent had identified, with a certain careful neutrality, as the particular concern of this particular apartment. AKO walked toward it with her easy, unhurried manner, the way she moved through all rooms, as though rooms held no particular surprises, and the narrator and B fell in behind her, which at the time seemed like the natural thing to do. The wardrobe room was dim, AKO's hand reaching for the light switch and not quite finding it in the first moment, and in that brief interval of semi-darkness the narrator saw something near the center of the room, something that held the unmistakable shape of a person, a long vertical form in absolute stillness, suspended in the air with the quality of something that does not breathe. She would later say, and would keep saying for many years after, that she could recall nothing specific about what she had seen, not the clothing, not the features, not even whether the dimness was sufficient to show features, only the shape itself, the shape of a human form held in perfect stillness, and the particular quality of silence around it. She found herself on the floor, her legs having made the decision before her mind had arrived at any decision at all, and from beside her be made a small, compressed sound, the kind a person makes when the body responds before the mind has understood what it is responding to. The light came on, and Ako stood in the doorway looking in, and the room was simply a wardrobe room, full of garments on their hangers and folded things on their shelves, and whatever had been visible a moment before was no longer visible, and Ako said something like, "Well then," and stepped inside without further comment. She gathered 2 folded sets of clothes from the shelves, one for the narrator and one for B, tucked them under her arm with complete efficiency, came back out into the hallway, and closed the door behind her with the ordinary soft click that closet doors make in quiet apartments at night. The narrator noticed, in the strange clarity that sometimes follows a shock, that Ako's expression throughout this sequence had been entirely untroubled, the expression of someone who has checked on something and found it to be exactly as expected. They moved to the bathroom eventually, because even in the presence of inexplicable things the body still wants to be warm and clean, and Ako went first while the narrator and B sat in the living room with their backs carefully turned toward the hallway door. The narrator would remember for many years afterward that a particular song was playing from Ako's small speaker during that interval, something bright and rhythmic that felt entirely wrong for the moment and became, because of that very wrongness, permanently attached to the memory, so that now whenever she hears that song she is back in that living room, her shoulder pressed against B's shoulder, listening for sounds from the hallway that might not be the ordinary sounds of an apartment building at night. Ako returned from the bathroom and said it was perfectly fine, in the tone that people use to indicate something is manageable if not entirely pleasant, and the narrator gathered herself and went. She had just stepped under the water and begun to breathe more evenly when she looked up toward the place where the wall met the ceiling and saw there a handprint, dark against the pale tile, small but deliberate, the fingers pressed so closely together that there was almost no space between them. She was in the hallway before she had fully processed what she had seen, clutching a towel, and when she found Ako and described the handprint, she watched Ako's face move through a transformation she had never witnessed before and would not forget for a long time. The pleasant, settled softness of Ako's ordinary expression gave way to something quite different, a precise and clear displeasure, the expression of someone who holds a high standard for certain things and has found that standard disrespected in a way she had not anticipated and did not intend to absorb quietly. Ako went to the wardrobe room and opened the door and spoke with the calm, measured authority of someone who has thought carefully about her position and has no intention of backing away from it. She observed that mischief and deliberate unkindness were not the same thing, that there was a meaningful distinction between them, and that a presence living as a guest in someone else's home carried certain responsibilities toward that home and toward the people who visited it. She observed further that the bathroom in particular was not a place for games, that she had cleaned it herself the previous day, that finding it marked when she had cleaned it was not something she would accommodate as a recurring arrangement. She concluded by noting, in a tone that was level and carried no room for negotiation, that if the bathroom were not restored to the standard she expected before they returned, there would be consequences of a domestic and particularly undignified nature for the wardrobe room itself. Then she closed the door and came back to the hallway and suggested, with a slightly apologetic look, that they might like to step out for a while, perhaps to the small bar a few minutes down the street, just to let the apartment come to its own arrangements in their absence. At the bar, in the warm and ordinary light that small bars in that part of the city always seem to maintain, the narrator found the fear loosening its hold on her, the way fear always does when there are familiar voices and something cold to hold in both hands and the ceiling is at a normal height above the tables. What stayed with her most was not the shape in the wardrobe room nor the handprint in the bathroom, but the image of Ako's face in that moment of clear displeasure, because Ako was, in all ordinary circumstances, a person whose expressions tended toward warmth and an easy patience, and to see that warmth replaced so cleanly by something so certain was, in its way, the most surprising thing about the evening. B mentioned this softly, and the narrator agreed, and they sat for a moment in the agreement, as friends do when they have witnessed something together and don't need to say more than they have already said. Ako told them, when they asked, that what had provoked her was not the presence itself but specifically the bathroom, because she had cleaned it thoroughly the previous afternoon and took a quiet but genuine pride in its cleanliness, and to find it marked when she had just finished, it was the particular kind of violation she found herself unable to absorb. She described the handprint with the analytical precision of someone who had looked at it more carefully than the narrator had, noting that the fingers had been pressed very close together, barely any gap between each one, and that this detail combined with the size of the print suggested a certain compactness of build, and the narrator sat across the table and found herself thinking that she had never heard anyone apply forensic reasoning to the physical characteristics of a ghost, and that this was perhaps the most Ako thing she had ever witnessed. B, for her part, was still murmuring something under her breath about the consequences Ako had named for the wardrobe room, and seemed, despite everything, to find this genuinely funny, which was, all things considered, the appropriate response. They returned when the last trains were still running, and the summer night had thinned enough at its edges to suggest that morning was somewhere ahead, and the apartment, when Ako opened the door, was exactly as they had left it, except that Ako's expression, when she went to the bathroom and looked in, had returned to its usual quiet pleasantness. The bathroom was not merely clean, it was clean in the way that suggests real attention, the tiles dried of all moisture, every surface wiped to a quality that held no trace of what had been there before, not even the dampness that should have lingered from the cleaning itself, and the narrator stood in the doorway and looked at it and felt something shift in her understanding. It was the cleaning, more than the haunting, that stayed with her as she settled into the borrowed futon that night, because the haunting was frightening and strange, but the cleaning was something else, something that implied a negotiation had taken place, a small exchange between two parties who inhabited the same space and had decided, after a difference of opinion, to continue on. From the other room, before the light went out, Ako remarked through the half-open door that the whole thing reminded her of the Cinderella story, someone who makes a mess and then, under sufficient moral pressure, makes everything right again, and she seemed genuinely pleased with this observation. And from that evening, the name simply attached itself, the way right names do, quietly and without ceremony, and Cinderella was what they called her after that, the presence of the wardrobe room, the one who arranged the clothes and occasionally passed through the hallway in the shape of a long shadow that dissolved when observed directly. The name fitted so naturally that it stopped feeling strange within a short while, the way a name does when it belongs, and AKO used it in conversation the way you might mention any housemate whose habits are known and whose presence is simply part of what home means. In the weeks and months that followed, the situation in the apartment settled into what the narrator could only describe as a domestic rhythm, unusual in its particulars but orderly in its overall shape, each party understanding, more or less, what was expected. Cinderella's greatest enthusiasm was for clothes. That much had been clear from the beginning, and in the wardrobe room she would arrange AKO's garments in combinations that could only be described as earnestly intentioned, complete outfits laid out on the floor from shoes to jacket as though assembled for someone to step into them, each selection guided by some private internal logic that remained entirely her own. AKO developed a habit, before leaving the apartment in the mornings, of looking over whatever had been assembled overnight and offering a brief critical commentary in the manner of a teacher addressing a student who has put in genuine effort but has not yet developed the necessary eye. The assessments were specific and delivered without heat. This pairing worked against itself rather than with itself. This particular silhouette was not serving anyone. This combination of colors had ambition that exceeded the result, and so on. Cinderella's response to a poor evaluation was, reliably, to redistribute other things around the apartment. Shoes shifted from their usual positions, the careful folding of organized items gently undone, and AKO would notice this on returning home and put everything back in order again, and in this way their days moved through their small recurring cycles. The narrator came to think of this arrangement, across the years she witnessed it, as something unexpectedly tender, the fashion experiments and the patient corrections having the quality of a very long conversation between two people who know each other well enough to disagree without it becoming anything more than a disagreement, and who go on sharing a home regardless. AKO mentioned once, in the casual tone she used for most things concerning Cinderella, that playing certain records by the British bands she was fond of caused the wardrobe room door to drift open by itself, just slightly, not enough to see inside, just enough to suggest that someone within had shifted position in order to hear better. She had experimented with other kinds of music and found that Cinderella's responses were not uniform, that certain louder or harder selections sometimes resulted in a compact disc being returned to the wrong case, and AKO understood this as Cinderella communicating a preference in the only vocabulary she had. The narrator visited the apartment several more times over the following years, staying overnight on occasion, and she encountered Cinderella again in small ways that carried none of the weight of that first night. A shadow moving past the bathroom door, a knock from inside a wall arriving in an unexpectedly even rhythm, small presences that she had learned, by now, to receive without dropping anything. Each overnight visit ended with a change of clothes laid out for her in the morning, sourced always from AKO's wardrobe and assembled according to principles that bore no relationship to season, occasion, or any known school of color coordination, and the narrator received these offerings with something that had moved, over time, from genuine alarm to a kind of affectionate resignation. The combinations were elaborate in their wrongness, a summer skirt paired with a thick winter sock, a formal jacket over beach shorts, a silk blouse tucked into trousers from a decade no one had quite forgiven, a delicate thing next to a sturdy one, a light color beside a dark one with no apparent reason given for either. She would hold them up and look at them, and what she felt by this point was not anything resembling fear but something closer to the feeling of receiving a gift that is not what you would have chosen but was chosen for you with complete sincerity, and the sincerity is in no way in question. Ako accepted all of it with the equanimity of someone who has made room, over a long period, in their understanding of the world for things that do not arrange themselves into a neat explanation, and the apartment continued to be one of the most orderly and quietly pleasant homes the narrator had ever sat still in. There was a particular afternoon, some years into the arrangement, when the narrator arrived to find Ako sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, the autumn light coming through the window in the soft amber way that late afternoon light moves through Japanese apartments in October. They sat together for a while without saying much, and the wardrobe room door was, as it sometimes was, very slightly open, and from within came the faint, unhurried sound of fabric shifting, garments being moved along their hangers, something making its quiet arrangements with the patience of something that has no particular schedule to keep. Ako glanced at the door, and the look on her face was the look people have when they are quietly aware of a presence they have grown long accustomed to, not love exactly, not the word you would reach for in speaking of a person, but something close to it, a settled recognition, a mild and genuine gratitude for the particular shape another presence makes in the rooms of an ordinary life. She mentioned that Cinderella had been, lately, somewhat more active than usual, the outfits more elaborate, the redistributions more thorough, and the narrator asked whether something had changed, and Ako said that she had been thinking, recently, about the future, and the word she used was simply the future, without decoration, without explaining very much more. The narrator understood, from this, that the apartment's chapter was perhaps approaching something like its end, and that Cinderella, in whatever way she perceived the world that moved around her, might understand this in her own way too. The evening wound down in the way that evenings do, the tea going cool, the sky outside moving from amber to the softer blue of early night, and Ako rose to put the kettle on again, and the narrator sat with the sounds of the apartment settling around her. The kettle hummed on the stove, and the city went about its business below the window, and from the wardrobe room came the occasional small sound of something being moved, and the narrator sat with all of it and thought that this apartment had been, for many years, a home in the fullest sense, not despite what lived in it but in some way that genuinely included it. What persisted beyond one form of existence, she found herself thinking, might simply be the things that had mattered most during it, a preference for certain music, a love of cloth and of the particular satisfaction of combining things, the need to be present in a place and to have that presence, in however sideways a fashion, acknowledged. She drank her tea in the amber light and the apartment held its quiet around her, and outside the city did what cities do, and inside, in the wardrobe room, something worked its patient way through the garments on their hangers, making arrangements no one would wear, because the making of them was its own sufficient purpose and needed no other reason. And so the evening settled, as evenings do, into the ordinary dark, and the records played their music through the quiet rooms, and the kettle cooled in the kitchen, and somewhere behind the slightly open door, something listened, and was, in its own particular way, content. That, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests for tonight, in the soft ordinary dark of an apartment where nothing dramatic is happening and nothing dramatic needs to, where two very different kinds of being have found, across many years and many small disagreements, a way to share a space with patience and something very much like warmth. And the warmth, even now, in the quiet telling of it, is still there. And so we leave that hallway behind, its echoes fading now like breath on a winter window, growing quieter, quieter, until there is only stillness. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders sink a little further, let the weight of the day settle somewhere beneath you where it cannot reach. The night is patient, and so are we. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, to a small mountain town where the rice fields stretch long and silver under an autumn moon, and where one woman began to notice, very slowly, that something in her home had changed, something she could not quite name, only feel, in the way the air moved differently through certain rooms at certain hours of the night. The house where this family lived had the quality of old houses in Japan, wooden floors that remembered each footstep in their grain, paper screens that softened the lamplight into something almost amber, rooms that held the sounds of daily life the way a bowl holds water. It was a year, nearly to the month, since the smallest member of that household had gone, a little one, not yet 3, carried away in an ordinary afternoon of the city that became something none of them had found plain words for since. The one who had been most changed by the loss was the older sister, a woman the family called Sazai, and the shape her grief had taken, in the long months between that day and this evening, was something the rest of the family had learned to live around the way water learns to move around a stone. Her younger brother, whose name was Katsuo, was the one who noticed things, who moved through the house with his eyes open in the way that certain people in a family always do, the quiet observer who carries the weight of what he sees without quite knowing where to set it down. And what he had seen, across that long year, was his sister slowly becoming someone who lived in 2 places at once in the present, where she cooked and laughed and moved through the daily rounds of the household, and in some other place, softer and more private, where a small life was still continuing. The doll had come into the house 5 months after the little one's passing, carried home by the father with the kind of tentative hope that fathers sometimes carry, not certain it would help, not willing to leave it untried. It was a simple thing. The doll, stuffed with cotton, shaped roughly to resemble a small boy, nothing remarkable about it except that it arrived at the right moment and in the right place to become remarkable. When the father set it near the family altar, among the photographs and the incense and the small offerings of tangerine and rice that the family renewed each morning, he had not known what to expect, and what happened next was the thing none of them had been able to predict. His sister came into the room and saw the doll, and her face did something it had not done in months. It opened, the way a window opens when someone finally reaches the latch, and she lifted the figure with both hands and held it to her chest and said the name softly, the name they had all been moving so carefully around for so long. And then she laughed, a real laugh, with warmth in it, and the family stood in the doorway and felt the strange doubled feeling that comes when something helps in a way you cannot quite approve of but cannot bring yourself to take away. In the weeks after the doll's arrival, the house recovered something of its daily warmth. Meals were eaten together again. Conversation moved more easily through the rooms. His sister no longer spent her afternoons in the dim quiet of her bedroom with the curtains drawn. She carried the doll with her through the day, and she spoke to it in the way she had once spoken to the little one, with the particular rhythms of a mother's voice, the teasing and the soothing and the small instructions about eating carefully and going slowly on the steps, and the doll, of course, was always silent. The family told themselves it was temporary, the way families tell themselves these things, a bridge between the unbearable and the livable, something that the mind constructs when it cannot yet hold the full weight of what has happened, a scaffolding that would come down in time. But 1 month passed, and then 2, and the seasons shifted outside the house, and the doll remained, growing softer at its seams, its fabric yielding to the constant handling, its stuffed form gradually losing the firmness it had once had, and still she carried it, still she spoke to it, still she set a small place for it at the table each evening. One night, not long before the evening Katsuo would later recall most clearly, his mother had made her one careful attempt to gently take the doll away, had reached for it with patient hands and a patient voice, with the quiet authority of a woman who believed that love sometimes required a kind of redirection. His sister had not been angry. Exactly, anger would have been in some ways easier to meet, but she simply had not understood, not in the way the mother meant, and she had pulled back with the absolute certainty of someone protecting what they love from something they cannot quite name. After that, the subject was left in the corner of the house where difficult subjects go when a family cannot agree on how to approach them, not forgotten, not resolved, simply set aside, the way you set aside a letter you do not yet have the courage to answer. The father and the mother were of a generation that did not easily bring such things to doctors or to clinical corridors. They believed that time would work its way through, that the mind would find its own path back, and in this belief they were not wrong, only perhaps mistaken about how long that path would be. The husband, Masuo, had his own grief to carry. A child lost is not carried lightly by any parent, and he had not been able to bring himself to treat his wife as someone in need of the kind of help that required forms and labels and the cold fluorescence of a waiting room. And so the household continued, through winter and into the slow turning of the following year, each of them navigating their separate accommodations with the doll, with the routines that had grown around it, with the careful management of what was said and what was not. It was on one of those evenings, with the lamp lit in the hallway and the smell of the evening's cooking beginning to move through the rooms, that Katsuo found himself in his younger sister's room, sitting beside Wakame on the tatami while she worked. She had the doll in her hands, and she was doing what she had apparently taken to doing in the quieter hours, mending it, carefully, drawing a needle and thread through the places where the seams had begun to give, refilling the head where the cotton stuffing had shifted and settled over months of use. It was delicate work, and she did it with the focused attention of someone who had practiced, the needle moving through the fabric in small, even stitches, her hands steady in the lamplight, a spool of thread in the shape of a small orange resting near her knee. Katsuo watched her and found himself thinking about the particular shape of this love, the love that mends in secret, that keeps things whole without being thanked for it, that asks nothing in return except that what it tends should continue a little longer. He did not say this aloud. It was the kind of thought that the people in his family kept quietly inside themselves, where it was comfortable, where it did not need to be explained or defended. It was in the middle of this quiet, Wakame's needle moving, the lamp warm above them, the house beyond the room making its small familiar sounds, that Katsuo became aware of a change in the quality of the air near the paper screen at the room's edge. He could not have said exactly what changed. It was not a sound, not quite a movement, more a sense that the silence on the other side of the screen carried weight, that it was not the ordinary empty silence of an unoccupied corridor. He turned too quickly, perhaps, so that the motion itself disturbed what he was turning to see, and in the moment after his turn, the screen was simply a screen, the hallway beyond it dim and still, the dim passage unremarkable in the way that hallways are when nothing is in them. But there had been something, he was almost certain, a quality of recent presence, the near imperceptible shift of air that happens when someone who has been standing in a place begins to move away from it. He told Wakame, quietly, that he thought someone had been in the hallway watching, and she looked at the screen for a moment and then looked back at him and said that it was probably nothing, in the way one says such things when agreement is what the room needs. He said aloud that it was certainly not their sister, that there was no reason their sister would have been standing in the corridor watching them at their work, and even as he said it, he understood that he was saying it because he needed to believe it, not because he had any evidence to offer. The doll was returned to the older sister in time for the evening meal, and the family assembled at the low table, the lamp warm above them, the steam from the dishes catching the light, the familiar geography of a family dinner in a wooden house in Japan. His sister settled the doll into the place beside her, and throughout the meal she brought food carefully to its mouth, speaking to it in the soft, encouraging tones of a mother with a child who is not eating as well as she would like, and the food fell softly back to the table each time, and no one commented, because this had long since become the known rhythm of their evenings together. After some time she noted, in the same ordinary way one might mention that the rice had gone a little soft, that the doll seemed unwell, that it had a headache, she thought, and perhaps a small fever, and that she believed she should take it to rest. She gathered it gently from its place at the table and excused herself, and her footsteps moved down the corridor toward the bedroom with the slow and careful pace of someone carrying something they do not want to disturb. The rest of the family cleared the table and washed the dishes, and the evening moved toward its ordinary end. Water in the kitchen sink, the low voice of a television program somewhere in the house, the small domestic percussion of a household winding toward sleep. Katsuo made his way toward his own room, and it was in the corridor that he slowed because from behind the paper screen of his sister's room, a sound had come to him, something that his mind took a quiet moment to identify. He stood in the hallway, with the lamp making its thin line of gold beneath the screen, and he listened, and what he heard was his sister's voice, very low, speaking in a murmur so reduced that the words themselves were lost, only their rhythm remaining flat and even, like speech from which the melody has been removed. He understood that she was speaking to the doll, soothing it in its imagined illness, and this alone would not have kept him there. He had heard it before, across many evenings, and had learned to pass it with the kind of gentleness one reserves for things one cannot change. What kept him there was the second sound, something beneath and alongside the murmuring, something that his ear sorted slowly from the rest, a careful, patient tearing, the way cloth sounds when it gives at a seam, soft and methodical, unhurried. He stood in the corridor for what felt like a very long time, one hand near the edge of the screen but not quite touching it, the sound of his own breathing the loudest thing in the hallway. It was Wakame who found him there, arriving quietly from the direction of the kitchen, carrying in her hands a small bowl that their mother had prepared, something warm, something soft, intended as an offering that the family had stopped questioning. She asked him, in a perfectly ordinary voice, what he was doing standing in the corridor, and he could not find an answer that was ready, and in the pause between his silence and her next question, she had already moved past him and drawn the screen open with her free hand. She took one step through the doorway, and then her foot stopped, and the bowl tilted in her hands, and she made a sound that was not quite a word, something involuntary, the kind of sound that arrives before the mind has finished understanding what the eyes have seen. Katsuo stepped past her into the room, and what he found there was this: his sister seated on the tatami in the middle of a kind of snow-white cotton, the stuffing of the doll, scattered in loose handfuls across the floor around her, drawn out with careful hands over what must have been a long and patient time. The doll's form lay in her arms, emptied now, its fabric loose and soft and deflated, the hollow shape of something that had once been filled, and his sister's face, turned down toward it, held an expression of such complete and focused tenderness that he found he could not look away. What she was doing with her hands, he would not give it more description than this. She had found her way to something she was trying, slowly, to swallow, something from the scattered cotton on the floor, and the logic of it, when it came to him, was the logic of a grief that had crossed over into a country none of the rest of them had the map for. He moved toward her before he had decided to move, and in that same moment their mother appeared in the doorway, drawn by the instinct that mothers develop across years for the moments when a room has need of them, and she took in what she saw with the quiet steadiness that had always been her particular strength. What followed was not dramatic, or rather it was the kind of drama that moves very quietly, the mother sitting beside her daughter on the tatami, placing one hand on her back, speaking to her in the low and certain voice she had always used when one of her children was sick or frightened and needed to find their way back to the ordinary world. His sister had needed some time, a few minutes, or longer, before the layer between herself and the present thinned enough for her mother's voice to reach her, and when it did, she surfaced slowly, the way someone comes back from a very deep and distant place, the light increasing by degrees. She looked at the emptied form in her arms, and then at the cotton scattered across the tatami around her, and something in her face began to shift, not breaking, exactly, but opening, the way certain things open when the pressure that has been holding them together is finally, gently released. She wept. Then, a sound different from anything she had made in the long year past, because this grief arrived without its covering, without the small stuffed intermediary that had been carrying it on her behalf through all those months, and it was close now, and real, and entirely hers. Their mother held her, and Katsuo stood in the doorway, and the room was quiet except for his sister's weeping and the soft sounds of the night beyond the house, a distant train, somewhere, and the small movements of the air against the screens. He did not go in. He understood that the room did not need him, that what was happening was between the two of them, in the particular language that exists between mothers and daughters and no one else. Later, standing in the hallway after the sounds had quieted and the lamp in his sister's room had been turned low, he found himself thinking about the doll, about Weikei mending it in secret, again and again, with her quiet and unannounced love, about his mother bringing it food each evening with the same careful attention she brought to everything she loved, about his father carrying it home in his arms with his uncertain and tender hope. They had all, in their different ways, been doing something like what his sister was doing, finding the form in which love could survive what had happened to them, the shape that grief could be held in without breaking the one who holds it, each of them building their small bridge across the same impossible distance. He could not say whether his sister had arrived, that night, at anything like resolution. Grief does not move in straight lines, and the country she had been traveling through was long, but he felt, standing in the dim corridor with the cold of the hallway floor under his feet, that something had shifted. Morning came to the house the way it had always come, arriving first in the pale light that gathered at the edges of the screens, then slowly filling the rooms, bringing with it the smell of miso warming on the stove and the particular sound of the kitchen beginning its day. His sister was at the stove when Katsuo came down, standing beside their mother, the two of them moving in the slow and practiced choreography of women who have shared a kitchen for many years, and there was laughter in the room, low and easy, the kind that rises without announcing itself. Wei-Kame appeared, quieter than usual, and took her place at the table, and breakfast was made and eaten, and the morning light deepened across the low table, and there was no doll, and no one spoke of this, because its absence was the kind that asked only to be acknowledged quietly, with the warmth of ordinary life continuing around it. His sister moved through the morning with a lightness that was also a kind of weight, the lightness of someone who has put something down after carrying it a very long time, who feels both the relief of the empty hands and the ache of what those hands had held. He watched her across the table and thought that he did not know what would come next, that grief does not end in a single night, that the road back is long and winds through country no one can map in advance, but that she was here, in this room, with them, and that this was not a small thing. He thought about the doll, too, about what it had been asked to do, and about the faithfulness with which it had done it, holding together under the weight of a love it was never designed to hold, being mended in secret so it could continue to serve a purpose no one had imagined for it. There is something in that, he came to feel, something in the image of his younger sister bent over her needle and thread by lamplight, quietly keeping a thing whole so that someone else could keep going, that seemed to him like a definition of family he had not previously had words for. The wooden house settled around them in the warming morning, its old joints making their small accommodations to the change of air, the screens admitting their long rectangles of early light across the tatami floor. Somewhere in the house, in a drawer, or wrapped carefully in cloth, or simply laid to rest, the emptied form of the doll was still, soft and worn and hollow, the vessel of a love that had needed somewhere to live while its bearer found her way back to living. And perhaps that is where this part of the story rests tonight, in the understanding that grief takes the forms it must, and that the love inside it, even when it cannot find its ordinary expression, is always real and always searching for something that will hold it. The morning light lay quietly across the table, and the kettle began to murmur on the stove, and the family moved through the gentle rhythms of an ordinary morning in a wooden house in Japan, with the particular tenderness of people who have been somewhere difficult together and found themselves, somehow, still here. And that, perhaps, is where we will leave them for tonight, in the amber of that morning kitchen, in the sound of the kettle, in the warmth of three people sharing a meal with an empty place among them that is not empty, not really, because what once filled it is still present in the way they sit together, in the way they are careful with one another, in the soft and lasting weight of what we carry for those we love. And so we leave that hallway behind, its echoes fading now like breath on winter glass, growing quieter and quieter until there is nothing left but stillness. There is no hurry. If you need a moment, take it, let your shoulders settle, let the weight of the day press gently downward into the mattress beneath you, and simply breathe. In, slowly, and out. The night holds plenty of room for rest, and these stories will wait for you, patient as moonlight. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, to a quieter town where the streets narrow and the old houses lean close together, keeping secrets that the neighbors have carried for years, in silence, the way people do. Some nights, the last train home feels less like a journey and more like a slow surrender, the world outside growing softer and darker with every station left behind. On this particular rural line, where the fields spread wide on either side and the mountains wait at the edge of the visible world, the stillness of a late train was something almost medicinal, something that asked nothing of the people riding it, and gave a great deal in return. He had not planned to stay out so late, and yet the evening had a way of expanding when good company was involved, and by the time he looked at his watch, midnight had already settled quietly over the town without him noticing. His section chief had suggested drinks after work, a mild suggestion, offered in the way that suggestions from section chiefs tend to be offered, with a warmth that makes refusal feel unnecessarily complicated, and so the hours had slipped away in the easy manner that hours have when one is not paying attention to them. He caught the last train by very little, sliding through the closing doors and finding the car nearly empty, the overhead lights humming softly to themselves in the way that overhead lights do when there is no one there to need them. The carriage was the old-style, four-seat clusters facing each other across a narrow aisle, the seats upholstered in a faded navy blue that had absorbed the weight of many thousands of commuters over many years and asked nothing of any of them. He settled into a window seat, stretched his legs forward in the manner of a man who has earned his tiredness, and felt the subtle swaying of the train begin its work on him almost immediately, that gentle rocking that belongs to rural lines and to no other form of travel. Outside, the town's edges gave way to the dark periphery of farmland, rows of bare rice stubble passing in the lamplight, the occasional cluster of houses with one warm light still burning in an upstairs window, someone up late, reading or worrying or simply unable to sleep. He watched the fields roll past for a while, the rhythm of the tracks underneath him a steady and almost musical thing, the percussion of iron on iron, regular as breathing, and then his eyes grew heavy, as eyes will, and he let them close. The sake had made him softer than usual, looser around the edges, and so when sleep came it came quickly and quietly, the sounds of the train folding themselves into a shapeless warmth around him, the swaying becoming indistinguishable from the small motions of a very deep rest. He did not know how much time had passed when something brought him back, not a loud sound, nothing abrupt or alarming, simply a small bright voice somewhere in the car, and a lower voice beside it, like two notes played gently in an otherwise quiet room. A child, and a woman. The child's voice was light and clear in that particular way that belongs to someone perhaps 5 or 6 years old, full of a kind of wondering precision, each word placed with the care of someone who has recently learned how much words can carry. The woman's voice beside it was gentle in the way that tired mothers are gentle, unhurried, accommodating, carrying within it both love and the particular weariness that lives alongside love when it has been practicing itself for several years without pause. He could not see them from where he sat. The high-backed cluster seating blocked his sight line to the rows ahead, and so he lay there half asleep, listening without quite meaning to, the way one does when sounds arrive at the drowsing edge of awareness and are neither welcome nor unwelcome. They were talking about trains, as near as he could tell, the child expressing something like deep, contented pleasure at the whole enterprise of being carried somewhere through the dark, and the woman responding in that unhurried way of someone who has answered the same kind of question many times and has arrived, finally, at a genuine fondness for being asked. The child mentioned a station they had visited together once, some distance from the line they were now riding, and recalled it with the particular vividness that children have for things that have pleased them profoundly, the details sharp, the feeling even sharper. The woman told him that she wished she could have taken him somewhere larger, somewhere with the great cathedral stations of the major cities, and there was something in her voice as she said it that was not quite regret but lived in the same neighborhood, a tenderness for a wish that had not quite been fulfilled. She mentioned a sleeper train, those long-haul overnight carriages that were already becoming rare even then, and said that she had wanted him to experience that kind of journey, the whole night given over to motion and the slow passage of dark countryside. The child said that he would have liked that very much, and the simplicity of the response, its sincerity, was the kind of thing that could make a person feel unexpectedly moved even half asleep on a late train with sake still warm in their chest. He was drifting, hovering at the pleasant surface of sleep, letting the conversation wash over him as background warmth, and then the woman said a word he had not heard spoken naturally in conversation for many years. She used the old name of the railway, not the name it had carried since the reorganization, but the earlier name, the one that belonged to the era of the national system, before the changes that had come when he was still in primary school, long before these particular trains had taken on their current designation. He lay still with his eyes closed and turned the word over quietly, the way one turns an unexpected object over in the hand to examine it more carefully. It was not impossible. Language moves at its own pace in rural places. Old usages persist in households where they were once the ordinary vocabulary, and there was nothing necessarily strange about a woman using a name her own parents had used, carrying it forward without thinking about it. He told himself this, and it was a reasonable thing to tell himself, and yet the word sat in the air of the carriage with a faint, inexplicable weight, the way an out-of-tune note sits in an otherwise ordinary piece of music. He opened his eyes and sat up a little, craning carefully to look over the seat back in the direction the voices had been coming from. The car was empty, as far as he could see, seat after seat, each one vacant, the overhead lights casting their even pale glow down the length of the aisle with nothing to illuminate but the blue of the upholstery and the dark glass of the windows running alongside. He sat back and blinked at the ceiling for a moment, then looked at the window, then looked at the seats again, trying to construct an explanation. The train had stopped at a station while he slept, someone had boarded, someone had disembarked, the sounds had carried from a different part of the car than he thought. All of these were possible, and he held them together for warmth, and the train moved on through the dark in its unhurried way, and the silence was complete. Then the voices returned. They came back in exactly the same unhurried manner as before, picking up the thread of their conversation as though no interruption had occurred, and he held himself very still and listened. The woman was speaking about something difficult, something that had happened some time ago, from the sound of it, something that had been frightening for both of them, though her voice around the memory was not frightened now, only reflective. The way voices go when they have had enough time and enough distance to hold a hard thing gently. The child replied that he had not been frightened, because she had been beside him, and there was something in his voice as he said it that was so simple and so complete that it held within it the whole architecture of what it means to feel safe, to know that someone will remain. The woman made a soft sound at that, not a laugh, not a sigh, something that was both at once, a breath that carried within it something worn and something glad, and then there was a brief silence in which the only sound was the train. And then the child spoke again, quietly, with a kind of calm wonder, and said that the crossing was coming soon. He turned toward the window without entirely meaning to, the way the body sometimes moves before the mind has decided anything, and looked out into the dark fields passing beyond the glass. The train was moving through open farmland, the countryside wide and still on either side, the rice fields bare in the winter, and ahead, around a long gentle curve in the line, He could see the signal lights of a level crossing blinking their slow red warnings into the night air. The sight was ordinary enough. Crossings like this one were scattered along every rural line, familiar and unremarkable, the kind of infrastructure that becomes invisible through repetition, and yet in the context of the voices and the empty seats and the strangeness of the old word, the crossing arrived with a different quality than crossings usually have. He watched it approach through the window, the red lights growing gradually more distinct as the train rounded the curve, the flat farmland spread dark on either side of the tracks, and somewhere in those few seconds of approach he thought he saw, or believed he saw, or did not quite see, some suggestion of shapes near the crossing figures, very still, standing in the darkness beside the line. He has said, on the occasions when he has told this story in the years since, that he cannot be certain what he saw in those moments. The night was dark, the train was moving, the glass of the window was fogged slightly at the edges, and what the eye reports from a moving vehicle at midnight is not always reliable, is often assembled by the mind from suggestion and expectation rather than observed cleanly. What he knows is that something registered some shape or impression against the dark background of the fields, and that the feeling it produced in him was the particular, quiet feeling of something not quite right, not alarm exactly but its calmer, older cousin, the kind of unease that arrives without announcement and settles into the chest and stays. The train passed through the crossing. Nothing happened. He sat very still for a moment with his hands in his lap and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension leave his shoulders the way tension does when the thing it was quietly bracing against simply does not come. The voices had gone, no sound from anywhere in the car but the familiar rhythm of the wheels on the rails, the low harmonic signature of the train itself moving through the night, steady and unremarkable, a sound he had heard hundreds of times before. He told himself, carefully and with some effort, that he had been half asleep, that the mind in that country between sleep and waking is not a reliable narrator, that it takes the materials of an ordinary situation and arranges them into patterns that feel significant without being so, that empty trains and late hours and sake and a peculiar word or two were enough to explain everything he had heard and thought he had seen. The explanation was reasonable, and he leaned on it the way one leans on reasonable explanations, not because they always convince entirely but because they are better than the alternative of having no explanation at all. Outside, the first lights of the town were reappearing at the edges of the dark, scattered houses, a lit convenience store, the glow of the small station up ahead materializing gradually through the window, and he gathered his coat and his bag and prepared himself for arrival. The announcement came over the speakers, soft, unhurried, the recorded voice naming the final stop in the calm and slightly formal manner of station announcements everywhere, and the train began its gentle, gradual deceleration, the platform lights drifting into view at the far end of the window. He was already at the doors, coat folded over one arm, bag in hand, watching the platform materialize from the dark as the train slowed the concrete, the yellow safety line, the station sign, familiar and solid and a relief. And then, in the glass of the door, in the narrow strip of reflection between himself and the world outside, he became aware that the car behind him was no longer empty in the way it had been empty before. Not a sound, not a movement, only an awareness, the way you sometimes know, without being able to explain how, that the space at your back has changed its quality, that the air behind you is occupied in a way it was not a moment ago. He looked at the reflection. What he saw there, he has described only in the quietest and most careful terms, and this carefulness itself tells something. A young woman, standing a few feet behind him, holding a child against her, and something about both of them that did not belong to the ordinary world of late trains and tired commuters, something that had come from another register of experience entirely. He has said that what he noticed first was the child's face, turned toward him, watchful in the still and particular way that children rarely are, the expression on it not hostile, not frightened, simply present in a way that felt complete and ancient, as though this moment of watching had been going on for a very long time. What had happened to them, the nature of it, the shape of it, arrived in him not as a sequence of understood facts but as a single, complete, wordless knowing, the way cold arrives, the way dark arrives, without stages or preparation. It had been the crossing, or something near the crossing, and it had been unkind, and it had not been recent, and in some way that was beyond his capacity to explain or to disbelieve. They were still here, still riding the line they had loved, moving through the familiar dark of the countryside in the way that some things do when the ordinary world has not quite been able to release them. The next minutes are not clear to him, only impressions. Afterward, the platform beneath his feet, the cool air, the station attendant's voice somewhere nearby, and then the small room behind the ticket window and a paper cup of water pressed gently into his hands by a man who asked, simply and without alarm, whether he was feeling all right. He said that he was, or something close enough to that it served the same purpose, and he sat in the chair they offered and held the cup and looked at his hands for a while, the way one looks at familiar things when the rest of the world has briefly become unfamiliar. He never asked the attendant whether anything had ever happened on that line, not at the crossing, not anywhere along it, not in the memory of the station or the people who worked there. He wanted to ask, and then he found that he did not want to ask, and that the second feeling was stronger than the first, because some things settle more gently when they are allowed to remain at the edge of certainty, where the mind can still offer other explanations if it needs them in the difficult hours. He took the bus home that night, and for several weeks afterward he arranged to finish work a little earlier than usual, and traveled in the bright middle of the afternoon carriages among the other passengers, and did not think too carefully about the last train through the dark fields. Gradually, as weeks have a way of doing when one allows them to simply pass, the edges of the experience softened, not disappeared, not become ordinary, but settled into the deeper layer of memory where things that cannot be explained are kept alongside the other improbable facts of a life. He came to feel, in time, that whatever he had encountered had not wished him any harm, that the woman and the child had not been aware of him in the way that the living are aware of each other only dimly, perhaps, the way a sleeping person is dimly aware of sounds in another room. They had simply been riding, he thought, moving through the dark of the countryside they knew, past the station, past the fields, past the crossing with its slow red warnings, in the way that perhaps the very deeply lost sometimes do, not haunting so much as simply continuing, tracing the paths that had mattered to them in life with the slow, unhurried persistence of water finding its way downhill. There is a kind of sadness in that image. When you sit with it long enough, the child who loved trains and who had wanted to ride the great sleepers, to see the cathedral stations of distant cities, kept instead to this one small rural line, this one quiet corner of the world he had known. And the mother, still beside him. Still choosing to be beside him. He learned, some months later and by accident rather than intention, that there had been an incident on that line some years before. He encountered the information sideways, without looking for it, and turned away from the details before they could become specific, and this felt like the right instinct, the right form of respect. What he kept instead was the feeling that the conversation had given him. In those minutes when he was half asleep and listening, the child's voice full of wonder at the simple fact of moving through the dark, the woman's voice carrying within it both love and the ache of an unfulfilled wish, and then the child's assurance, so quiet and so complete, that he had not been frightened because she had been there. The line still runs. As these lines do, small rural railways persist in Japan with a kind of quiet stubbornness, serving towns that might otherwise have no connection to the larger world, carrying their handful of passengers through the morning and the evening with the steady, unspectacular dedication of things that simply continue because continuing is what they are for. The same blue carriages, the same rhythm on the same tracks, the fields in winter bare and in summer heavy with rice, the crossing with its red lights blinking through all seasons, the final station with its fluorescent lamp and its vending machine and its single attendant in the late hours. On most nights, the last train arrives empty at its terminal, the seats quiet, the aisle still, the overhead lights humming their low note to no one in particular, and the attendant makes his rounds and switches off what needs switching off, and the station settles into its nighttime quiet. And perhaps, on some of those nights, something else also arrives, something that belongs to the line in a way that is older and more settled than any schedule, something that has found its comfort in the gentle motion and the dark fields passing and has simply never found a reason to leave. Whether that is a sad thing or a peaceful one, he said in the telling, he was no longer certain, only that the thought of them had lost its sharpness over the years, had softened into something more like acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the strange and layered nature of the world we move through without fully understanding. He took the last train again, eventually, because life insists on it, the late meetings, the missed connections, the evenings that run longer than anyone planned, and the train is still the most sensible way home. He sat by the window and watched the dark fields go by, the same fields he had watched before, the same utility poles marking the same intervals of darkness, the same distant farmhouses with their single lights burning somewhere in the upper rooms. When the train rounded the long curve and the crossing came into view ahead, he looked at the signal lights blinking their slow red warnings into the air, and he let himself look, and the crossing was quiet, and the fields on either side were still, and there was nothing there but the night and the cold and the ordinary distance between one place and the next. He let out a slow breath, and settled back into his seat, and listened to the rhythm of the wheels on the rails carrying him home. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in the steady motion of a small train moving through dark fields, the crossing behind it now and the station ahead, the red lights fading into the distance, the car quiet, the night doing what the night always does, which is simply to continue, gently, until the morning finds its way back. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its quiet settle like dust in still air, and there is no hurry. If you need a moment, take one now, let your breath find its own slow rhythm, let your shoulders soften against whatever is holding you. The night is patient, and so are we. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, to a place where old houses hold old silences, where the air carries the faint smell of cedar and something older still, but there is no need to reach for it just yet. Rest here, in the space between, and let the quiet do what quiet does. Some summers hold their grief slowly, the way a room holds warmth long after the lamp has been turned down, and this story belongs to such a summer, warm and still, pressing gently on the skin. Somewhere in the mountains of his mother's home province, the extended family had gathered for the 49th day, the day when, by long tradition, the soul of the departed is thought to have settled, finally, into whatever comes next. He was a young man who had loved his grandfather very much, and the afternoon had grown difficult in the way memorial gatherings sometimes do, with relatives asking about his studies and whether there was anyone special in his life. So he slipped away, walking the old road through the village and out along the edge of the mountain, toward a small clearing his grandfather had always loved. It was less a park than a feeling, a wooden bench, a low table between the roots, and overhead the wide arms of the trees, making the shade welcome even in the height of August. His grandfather had brought him there many times as a small child, carrying a cloth bag with toucan teas and whatever small cookies his grandmother had wrapped carefully in wax paper that morning. Now he sat alone on the same bench, and the cicadas sang in long warm waves that rose and fell with the August air, and the leaves moved softly above him, stirred by a wind too gentle to feel on the skin. He sat for a while thinking about his grandfather's hands, about particular afternoons that now, in memory, seemed to hold more light than they had possessed at the time, the way certain things become luminous only when they are no longer possible. He was not ashamed, he would later recall, that he cried there in the shade, the kind of quiet crying that grief sometimes saves for when one is finally alone enough to receive it, far enough from other people to let it arrive without needing to be managed. After a while the tears passed, and he felt the particular calm that follows grief, the way a field looks after rain, washed and still and almost peaceful, and the afternoon had grown longer and softer, and he thought it was time to return. He stood up from the bench, and the world moved. Not with any force, it was more like the feeling of rising too fast from a warm bath, a slow rocking sensation, the ground seeming briefly uncertain of its own arrangement. He sat back down and waited for it to pass, and it did pass, and he stood a second time, and again the same gentle tilting came to him, and his ears held a thin, distant ringing, high and quiet as a string plucked in another room. The cicadas, he noticed, had stopped, not gradually, the way insects sometimes wind down in the evening, but all at once, as though they had simply been removed from the air. The world was quieter than a mountain clearing in August has any reason to be, and the light seemed to have a quality he could not name, and his head filled slowly with a pale whiteness, like fog coming in from somewhere behind his eyes. He would not be able to account for how long passed between that moment and the moment he opened his eyes again. There was no interval he could describe, only before and after, with nothing occupying the space between. It was dark, but not quite the right kind of dark for a rural August evening, which ought to have been softened at least faintly by distant windows and the few available street lamps along the road. Instead there was a light that did not come from any source he could locate, a visibility that belonged to no known hour, and the clearing was around him, unchanged, but the world beyond it felt different in a way he could sense before he could describe. He walked back toward the village, following the road he knew, and many things were correct: the turn at the base of the hill, the low stone wall along the field, but other things were not quite right, buildings standing where he remembered open land, and gaps where familiar structures had always been. He moved carefully, telling himself that grief and heat and whatever had happened on the bench had disordered his memory, and perhaps that was true, and he kept walking, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. His grandfather's house was there, where it had always been, and the relief of seeing it was something he could feel in his chest, the kind of relief that arrives as a physical sensation rather than a thought. He went to the door and found it locked, which was strange, because the house had been full of relatives all day, coming and going through the unlatched front entrance the way families do during gatherings. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door he could see a shape moving slowly toward him from the far end of the hallway, and he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The door opened. His grandfather stood in the doorway, wearing his old grey cardigan, in house slippers, looking at his grandson with a mild and puzzled expression, the kind a person has when they are not expecting a visitor at this particular hour. The man who had died, whose 49th day they had all traveled to observe, whose bones the family had received in a white box not yet a month and a half ago, stood there in the soft light of the entryway, entirely present, entirely alive. He could not speak, not because fear arrived sharply, but because every explanation he reached for dissolved before it could form, and what remained was a total, very still blankness in which no words were possible. His grandfather murmured something to him, the voice exactly right, the particular roughness and warmth of it exactly as he remembered, but the words arrived in his ears as a formless, gentle sound, shaped like language but carrying no meaning he could reach. His grandfather stepped forward and placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and spoke again in that same soft, unreadable murmur, and it was then that something shifted in him, not a sharp fear but a slow wave, the way cold water enters when a seal gives way somewhere deep. He stepped back and walked away from the house, and then faster, and the village passed around him in that half-familiar way that dreams sometimes present a known place, correct in outline but quietly wrong in the details, walls where windows should be. He walked until he needed to stop, and then he stood and breathed, and only then remembered his phone. His mother answered, and her voice was exactly her voice, but the words that came through it were that same soft, undecipherable sound, not Japanese, not any language he had learned, though it moved with the rhythms and warmth of her particular way of speaking. He ended the call and stood alone on a road that almost knew him, in a version of August that matched the one he had left in almost every way, except the ways that mattered most. After some time he thought of the police box, the Koban, and made his way to it through streets that were mostly familiar, with signs he could not quite read, the characters arranged in combinations that resembled familiar writing but slid past understanding when he tried to hold them still. The officer inside was alone, unhurried, with the calm appearance of someone waiting out a quiet evening, and he went in and spoke a simple greeting, and the officer looked at him with something like surprise and replied in that same unreadable language. He sat in that small room and felt the particular loneliness of being understood by no one, not the ordinary loneliness of distance or argument, but a deeper kind, where the very medium of connection has been taken away. He cried in front of the officer without self-consciousness, the way one cries when one has genuinely forgotten there are other people nearby. The officer, flustered but gentle, brought paper and a pen, and he wrote his name, and pointed to himself, and something passed between them that was not quite language but was near enough to it, the understanding that two people sometimes reach when both of them are trying very hard across a wide distance. The officer made a phone call, and then brought him tea and a small sweet, a confection shaped like a flower, soft and faintly sweet, not quite like anything he had tasted before, and he ate it slowly, in the quiet of the Koban, while waiting for whatever would happen next. A tall man in a suit arrived after some time, with glasses and a measured, careful manner, and led him to a dark blue car and drove through the night while making a succession of brief telephone calls in that same unhearable language, his voice low and businesslike. He fell asleep in the car, or something arrived that had the texture of sleep, and when he next became aware of himself, he was in a long corridor, and then being led into a room with several beds. In one of the beds, a man perhaps in his early 40s lay looking at the ceiling, a bandage around his head, and a kind of settled heaviness in his face that suggested he had been in that room for some considerable time. This man looked over at him after a long moment and spoke in Japanese, with the particular softness of the Kansai accent, and the relief of hearing a familiar voice was complete and total, the way warmth arrives when you step in from cold rain. He was from Noro, the man said, and had come to this place nearly 3 months before, and had not yet found a way back, and he spoke of this with the quiet resignation of someone who has moved through the acute phase of something and arrived at a different kind of steadiness on the other side. He explained the facility as he understood it, a place for people who had come from elsewhere, he said, using the word with care, placing a small pause around it as one places a stone somewhere delicate. They talked through the hours in low voices, comparing what each knew, and from 2 incomplete accounts they assembled something like a rough outline of what had happened, and what the general shape of things appeared to be here, in this other arrangement of the country they recognized. Each morning, someone came to administer a small injection, brief, matter-of-fact, leaving no particular sensation, and both of them were troubled by it in the quiet way that helpless situations produce a quiet unease rather than any louder feeling. On the 5th day, an elderly man entered the room before the light had fully changed, small, white-haired, wearing a physician's coat, moving without hurry, and beckoned with one hand and led him down the corridor to a different room. This man spoke to him in Japanese, softly and correctly, with the measured pacing of someone who has said the same words before and knows which ones carry weight, and he asked where he had come from, and listened to the answer with careful attention, nodding once. There were conditions, he was told, spoken without hardness. He was not to carry back any photograph or record of this place. He was free to tell his story, but not in a way that would amount to proof of anything, and he was not to return to the clearing in the mountains, because a second crossing would not offer a second return. He agreed to all of it without hesitation, with the particular willingness of a person who would have agreed to nearly anything, and the old man made a phone call, and a younger man came, and he was led to a black car outside, and the drive began. He felt, as the car moved through the dark, a quiet sadness that he had not been able to say goodbye to the man from Noro, had been led out without warning, without the small acknowledgement that the situation had seemed to call for, and he carried that unresolved courtesy with him into whatever came next. At some point the drive became a deep and effortless sleep, the kind that arrives after great sustained effort, and then, quietly and simply, he was lying on his back in his grandfather's garden, looking up at an ordinary morning sky. He went inside, and the door was unlocked, and the house was full of the ordinary sounds of morning, the low murmur of the television in the next room, the sound of water in the kitchen, voices exchanging something small and domestic. And his grandfather was there, at the kitchen counter, with his back turned, asking in his ordinary voice whether anyone wanted more rice. He stood in the doorway and looked at the old man for a long, still moment, and his grandfather eventually turned and looked back at him with warm puzzlement, the way one looks at a younger person who has been standing too quietly in a doorway for longer than seems necessary. Later, when he had time to sit with it, he came to believe that he had not returned to the world he had left, but to one nearby, a version of that August in which his grandfather had not been at a certain intersection on a certain morning, and had therefore not been in the accident, and was therefore still here, still asking about breakfast, still wearing the grey cardigan. All the evidence of the other world, the grief, the hospital, the white box, the particular weight of the weeks that had followed was simply absent, replaced by the quiet, ordinary fact of the old man's continued presence, pouring water into a kettle on an ordinary morning. His family had nothing to remember and nothing to explain, because in their version of the summer, nothing had needed to be mourned. He told his story over the following months to a few people, and no one believed him, and he understood why, because the evidence that made it feel most true to him, his grandfather alive and asking about rice, was the same evidence that made the rest of it impossible to demonstrate. He found he could not quite settle the question of which world was properly his, whether the one that held his grandfather's grave was the one he had been born into, or whether this one was, and the other had been the dream. What he knew was this, that he was glad beyond easy words that the old man was alive, and that he was frightened of the day when that would change, because he had already learned once, in a world that left no record of the lesson, how total the absence of a person can feel, how it reaches into ordinary hours and changes the shape of them. His grandfather would soon turn 78, still living in the mountains, still walking in the evenings along the roads he had always walked, and the young man had not returned to the clearing, honoring the one promise that had been asked of him, in that other place, by whoever had asked it. Sometimes, in a city apartment on a rainy evening, he would find himself thinking about the man from Noro, the settled heaviness in his face, the quiet certainty with which he had mentioned he would not be going back, and wondering whether anything had shifted for him in the time since, whether the months had offered him something like acceptance, or at least the softer thing that comes after. There was no way to know, and perhaps that is the nature of such things, that some of what happens at the margins of the world cannot be gathered back into any ordinary accounting, and must simply be allowed to remain there, at the edge, where we cannot follow it. What remained to him was a grandfather who was alive, and a memory of grief that no one else shared, and the understanding that the world is not a single line drawn from birth to now but something wider and less fixed, folded in ways that most people are never close enough to the fold to sense. There are evenings, he would softly note, when he sits somewhere ordinary, the back of a taxi moving through the lit streets of the city, or a waiting room with a window that faces the evening traffic and the sound around him fades just slightly, or the light changes in some small way, and for a moment he feels again the quality of that August clearing, the cicadas gone quiet all at once, the ground uncertain beneath him. And then it passes, as such moments do, and the world reassembles itself around him with all its ordinary sounds and its ordinary arrangements, and he is simply a young man in a city, on his way from one place to another. His grandfather is still in the mountains, still wearing the grey cardigan, and will turn 78 before the summer ends, and the two of them will likely sit together again in some warm room and drink tea and say a little more than is strictly necessary, in the gentle way that people do when they have understood, without ever quite discussing it, that time is neither infinite nor guaranteed. And that, perhaps, is where this story settles for tonight, not in the mystery of which world we belong to, but in the soft and ordinary fact of a kettle warming on a counter, and an old man still in his cardigan, and the quiet, patient weight of love that continues across whatever distances the world has placed between us and the people we have not yet learned to do without. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows fading now like the last moments before sleep fully arrives. There is no hurry. If you need to settle deeper into your pillow, to let your shoulders drop a little further, to release one more slow breath into the quiet of the room, please do. The night holds all the time you need. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, somewhere smaller and warmer, where the sounds outside are gentle and far away. But before we arrive there, simply rest for a moment here, in the soft space between one story and the next, where nothing is asked of you, and the only thing left to do is let yourself drift a little further down into the stillness. Somewhere in the long silence between loops, he had begun to lose count of the small things, the color of a tie worn on a particular Tuesday in 1987, the name of a colleague who had moved to Osaka, the precise number of steps between the station and his mother's house along the old shopping street. Not all memory is worth keeping, he had slowly come to understand, and some of the most exhausting work of those 300 years had been learning which recollections to release, the way one lets paper go from an open hand on a still evening, watching it drift without reaching after it. He was, by his own reckoning, 38 years old on the surface, the same 38 he had always been when he found his way back to this narrow window of time, and yet within the quieter rooms of himself, he carried something much older and more worn, something that had no name in ordinary life. Pause. Somewhere along the way, perhaps around the 50th loop, perhaps the 100th, he could no longer say with certainty, the urgency that had once driven him had softened into something more like listening, more like the patience of a man who has learned that stillness is its own form of movement. He had written, in his small notebook with the water-stained cover, that the loops had begun to feel less like second chances and more like slow lessons, the way a river teaches a stone not through force, but through patient, repeated contact, wearing away only what was never truly necessary. In the early years, when he had first understood what he was capable of, that strange, half-dreaming method he had stumbled upon as a teenager, lying on his futon with the summer fan turning overhead and the cicadas loud in the late August dark, he had felt something close to a wild and intoxicating freedom, the kind that arrives before experience has had time to temper it. Breath. He had gone to the stock market armed with knowledge no other man alive possessed, had watched the numbers move exactly as he had anticipated, had seen the money accumulate with the quiet certainty of a tide coming in on a windless morning, unhurried and inevitable. He had returned to the woman he had loved at 22, the one with the dark hair and the particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking carefully about something, and had done everything differently this time, had been braver and more patient and more present, had married her in the loop where she finally said yes, in a small ceremony at a neighborhood shrine in the early autumn. And yet, even in that loop, even sitting across from her at the low table in the apartment they shared in Setagaya with the winter light coming pale through the shoji screens, he had known that something fundamental had not changed, that the shape of things was more fixed than he had imagined, that fate does not bend so much as it shifts slightly, like a river finding its way around a stone placed in its path. She had still grown quiet and distant in her own particular way, and he had still found himself working long hours at the office in Shinjuku, and the autumn had still arrived with its familiar weight of endings, not because he had failed, but because some things, he was slowly beginning to understand, were simply woven into the cloth of time itself, and no hand could unpick them without unraveling something else. Long pause. He had tried, in one loop that remained clearer to him than most, to prevent the earthquake, to use what he knew about that particular March morning to send some warning out into the world that might, in some small way, alter the weight of what was coming. He had written letters to members of the Diet, careful, measured letters that laid out what he knew in the most reasonable terms he could manage, the kind of warning a concerned and responsible citizen might offer, without revealing anything that would cause the letters to be set aside unread. He had waited through those weeks before March of 2011 with the particular stillness he had spent many loops learning to hold, watching the calendar move forward with the patience of someone who has already seen what lies at the end of a road and has not yet found any way to redirect it. Pause. And the earth had still moved, as it always did, with a force that no letter could have forestalled. The sea had still risen in the way he had seen it rise before, and had taken with it everything that stood in its path, and he had sat in his apartment in Tokyo as the building swayed around him, one hand on the edge of the desk, feeling the same particular helplessness he had felt in every previous version of that morning. He had wept, in some of those loops, and in others he had simply sat in the shifting room very quietly, watching the things on the shelves tremble, and in others still he had done both, wept first, then gone to silence, and none of it had changed the morning that followed. 300 encounters with the same grief, held across what his body understood as a single continuous lifetime, and yet he had arrived, without drama or announcement, at a kind of peace with it, not the peace of someone who no longer feels, but the quieter peace of someone who has learned to carry a sorrow without making it the only thing they carry. Breath. He had come to understand, over those long centuries of accumulated days, that there is a difference between what fate will not permit to change and what a person has simply not yet found the courage to attempt, and that he had spent a great deal of his time confusing the two. The question that one person on the message board had asked him, "What will you do in the next loop?" That small and honest question had found him unexpectedly, had slipped past the careful distance he usually kept from questions he was not ready to answer, and had settled somewhere in him with a weight that was not unpleasant, only true. Pause. He had read it on his phone at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes at 10:30 at night, a cup of cold barley tea sitting untouched at his elbow, the apartment quiet around him in the way that Tokyo apartments are quiet after everyone else has finally gone to sleep. Most of the questions had been what he expected. Could you bring back money? How do you know it is real? Have you ever met yourself from another loop? What does it feel like to remember so many lives? And he had answered them carefully, the way a very tired traveler answers the questions of someone who has never left the same village, not unkindly, but with an awareness of how much is truly untranslatable. But this one question, the small one, the honest one, had touched something in him that had not been touched in a long time, and he had sat with it for several quiet minutes before he began to compose his reply. He had thought, first, of all the things he had already tried, the investments, the changed romances, the letters to people in power, the careful and methodical attempts to steer his life toward something that felt more right, more complete, though he could no longer say with confidence what exactly he had been aiming for. He had thought of his father, who had died in the mid-90s of the kind of illness that is too quiet to announce itself until there is very little time remaining, and how he had sat by the hospital bed in many loops and said the things he had always meant to say, and how each time it had felt real and complete, and how there had still been, in the air of that room, something that no amount of preparation could fully reach. He had thought of his sister in Nagoya, and how the distance between them had always been both geographical and something harder to name, and how he had been a more present brother in some loops and a more absent one in others, and how neither version had entirely resolved the quiet thing between them that remained quietly unresolved. And then, without quite planning to, he had thought of his mother. Pause. She was in her early 60s in this part of the timeline, still walking to the shops in the neighborhood where she had lived for 40 years, the same narrow streets, the same persimmon tree with its branches reaching over the low wall of the corner house, the same route she had taken so many times that her feet knew it without her needing to pay any particular attention. She had always carried her shopping bags the same way, one in each hand, her shoulders holding the familiar weight of them with the unpretentious ease of someone who has been doing a thing for long enough that the effort has become invisible, and he knew her walk from 30 meters away, knew the particular rhythm of it, knew how she would pause at the corner to check for traffic even when there was none. She had fallen on the way home from shopping. This was the fact he had known for many loops now, the one that had worn a groove in the floor of his memory over time, and yet it was also the thing he had never, across all those 300 years, truly faced directly, because some knowledge is so painful that the mind keeps it at a careful distance until it is finally ready to come closer. In every version of this life, his phone had rung on that particular evening in autumn, and it had been his sister's voice, low and careful, and the words had been the same words in every loop, and he had driven to the hospital through the same heavy rain, and she had already been gone when he arrived. He had been at work when it happened. This was always the particular cruelty of the shape it took, and he had told himself, across so many iterations of that long drive through the rain, that this was among those things woven too deeply into the structure of events to be touched by any hand. Pause. But sitting at the kitchen table in this loop, with the cold tea at his elbow and the refrigerator humming softly in the dark corner of the room, he understood something that surprised him in its simplicity, that he had never truly tried to change this one, not once in 300 years, because he had been too afraid to discover whether it was unchangeable or whether he simply had not been brave enough to find out. He had been carrying a fear, not a dramatic one, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that settles in the chest like a smooth and heavy stone, afraid that trying would only confirm what he already dreaded most, that some losses are simply absolute, and that the kindest person he had ever known was going to leave him in the same autumn, in the same rain, loop after loop, and that nothing in the long machinery of time would spare her. He had typed his answer slowly, rereading each sentence before moving to the next, a habit he had developed over years of lives lived carefully and relived more carefully still, until the words felt like something he had always been meaning to say but had not known how to arrange until this particular night. Pause. He wrote that he had spent a very long time thinking only of himself, trying to become wealthier, to correct old regrets, to find love that had escaped him, to prevent disasters larger than any single person, and that all of it had been, in its own way, a slow and patient avoidance of the one thing he had always known and never done. And then he wrote the other thing, the quieter thing, the one that had been waiting somewhere in the back of all those centuries for him to finally make his way to it. He wrote that in the next loop he would not go to work on that particular autumn day, that he would call his office in the morning with the kind of mild and believable excuse that a reliable salaryman offers once a decade, The kind that is accepted without ceremony and forgotten by afternoon, and then he would take the train to his mother's neighborhood. He would arrive at her door while the persimmon leaves were still gold on the tree and the morning still held some warmth in it, and she would be pleased and a little surprised to see him on a weekday, and he would tell her that he had the day free and thought she might want some company at the shops. Pause. She would protest gently, as she always had, that she was perfectly capable of managing the shopping on her own, and she had always been. There was never any question of that, and he would agree, and then he would ask if he could walk with her anyway, because it had been a long time since they had walked anywhere together, and this would be true no matter how many times he had lived the years before it. She would consider this for a moment and then hand him the shopping list, and he would read it, and it would be the same modest list it had always been: a few vegetables, a piece of fish, a small bag of the rice crackers she had always preferred, and they would set off together through the morning air. They would walk past the bicycle shop where the old man in the white apron always stood, who would nod at them from his doorway in the way he had been nodding at people in that neighborhood for 30 years, and past the persimmon tree, and she would tell him the small news of the street: the family on the corner had moved away, the new bakery was not quite as good as the old one had been, the crow that visited her garden each morning had not come for 3 days, and she was keeping a gentle watch for it. And he would listen, truly and completely listen, in the way he had not always managed to when he was younger and more preoccupied with the larger things he had imagined were more important, and the conversation would be exactly what it was, nothing more and nothing less, ordinary, unhurried, the kind of talk that moves between a mother and a son on a quiet autumn morning when neither of them is in any particular hurry anywhere. Long pause. Whether the fall would happen anyway, on some other street, in some other arrangement of the afternoon, he could not know, and he had arrived, finally, at the place where not knowing was something he could hold without it breaking him, where the uncertainty did not need to be resolved before the walk could be taken. What he could offer was his presence on that morning, not the memory of being there, not the intention of being there, but the actual and unhurried fact of it, his hand on her shopping bag, his attention given wholly to her voice, his footsteps beside hers along the narrow street where the persimmon tree cast its autumn light. He posted his answer and set his phone down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the city, where the street lamps were doubled in the wet surface of the street far below, and where somewhere in the middle distance a train was moving along its elevated track with the soft, patient sound of something that does not need to announce itself to be present. The thread had continued a little after that. More questions came in, some curious, some gently skeptical, one or two that seemed to wish him well without quite saying so, and he answered what he could before the hour grew late enough that the cold tea finally seemed beyond rescuing. Breath. There was something he had not told anyone on the thread, a thing he had carried through the loops for so long that it had become simply part of the texture of who he was, the accumulated weight of the small moments in which his mother had been most fully herself, not the large occasions but the quieter and more ordinary ones. He held, in the careful archive of his long memory, the way she had looked at him on the morning of his university entrance exam, proud and worried in approximately equal measure, her hand smoothing the collar of his jacket with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been making sure of small things for a very long time. He held the way she had continued to send him a handwritten card on his birthday each year without exception, even after he had moved far enough away that a phone call would have done just as well, because she had always believed that some things were worth the extra effort of paper and a stamp and the particular attention of handwriting. He held the way she had mentioned, over dinner during one particular visit, that she sometimes wished they saw each other a little more often, said it without complaint, in passing almost, the way people mention things they do not want to make into a burden, and how he had agreed and then let 6 months pass without visiting, because there was always something, and the 6 months had quietly become 8, and then the phone had rung in the autumn rain. Pause. 300 years, and that sequence of events had not once changed: the 6 months, the 8 months, the rain, the call on a weekday evening in October. Only now, sitting in the late kitchen with the city murmuring softly beyond the window, did he understand with any clarity that the part worth changing had never been the rain or the phone call, but the 8 months that came before, and that this was what 300 years had been patiently, gently, and without any urgency trying to bring him to. He closed the water-stained notebook and set it back in the corner of the desk where it always lived, and turned off the small lamp beside the window, and for a moment the room held only the diffused light of the city coming through the glass, everything softened and unsharp, the outlines of familiar things just barely visible. He lay down on the futon in the way he always did when a loop was approaching its turning point, and let his breathing slow by itself, without any effort or intention behind it, and let the distant hum of the city settle around him the way familiar things settle, without ceremony, without needing to be noticed. The next loop, when it came, would begin the same way it always did, the same grey morning light through the same curtains, the same sound of a neighbor retrieving their newspaper from the hall, the same sense of standing again at the beginning of a long road he had walked many times before and would walk again with whatever patience and care he still had available to bring. Breath. But this time, he thought quietly to himself in the dimming room, the road would have a clear destination from the very first morning, not a grand one, not an outcome to be executed or a disaster to be prevented, but simply a street and a tree with its gold leaves and the weight of a shopping bag and the voice of someone he had been walking beside, in one way or another, for 300 years. There is a kind of understanding, he had come to feel, that can only be reached by going the long way around, that cannot be arrived at by the direct route, because the direct route does not teach what the long way teaches, and perhaps that was what all of those years had been quietly, patiently preparing him for. Not the accumulation of advantage, not the correction of past regrets, not even the prevention of loss, but the slow and gentle arrival at the knowledge that some mornings are worth more than all the arrangements you might have made, and that the most important thing you can do with an ordinary autumn Tuesday is simply be where you are needed, unhurried, carrying the bags. Pause. Somewhere in the city beyond the window, a train moved through the dark on its long and familiar route, and the sound of it reached through the glass like a soft exhalation, present in the room for only a moment and then folded quietly back into the general hum of the night, leaving no trace. And that, perhaps, is where the chapter rests for tonight, in the dark room of a man who had lived 300 years and learned, at last, the only lesson that had ever truly been waiting for him, which was a small one, and ordinary, and enough. And so we leave that hallway behind, its whispers fading now like breath on cold glass, growing softer and softer until there is only silence. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders sink a little deeper, let your hands grow still, let the darkness behind your eyes settle into something gentle and wide. The night holds plenty of room for rest. When you are ready, our next story takes us to a quieter setting, somewhere unhurried, where the world moves at the pace of falling snow or turning pages, a place that asks nothing of you but simply to listen and to drift. Somewhere in the memory of a house, there are sounds that never quite leave: the low whistle of a kettle, the soft pour of water, the small settling of ceramic against warm wood. She was a woman of stillness, the grandmother, and her name in the old characters meant something like love of light, though no one in the family called her anything but Obachan, grandmother, in the warm, rounded syllables of the Osaka dialect she had spoken all her life. Every day, for as long as anyone in the family could remember, she made her tea at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not at 2:30, nor at 3:15, nor at any of the softened intervals between. 3 o'clock, always, the way the sun moved to a certain angle in the kitchen window and the light shifted from white to something closer to gold, and the house around her seemed, in some quiet way, to recognize the hour. She had a teapot she preferred, a small, round, clay vessel with a short spout and a lid that fit snugly, the kind of teapot that seems to have absorbed decades of warmth into its walls, darkened now to the color of old bark, worn smooth at the handle where fingers had held it morning after morning, afternoon after afternoon, for more years than anyone had troubled to count. The ritual was unhurried and precise. She would measure the leaves with a small bamboo spoon kept beside the tin, pour the hot water in a slow, deliberate circle, set the lid gently in place, and then wait one exact, patient minute before she poured. The tea that came out was always a calm, pale green, the kind of color that seems to belong to early spring mornings or to the inner light of a garden resting in quiet rain. Her granddaughter, the one who tells this story now, looking back across years, was the youngest of the grandchildren who spent summers in that Osaka house, and she remembers sitting on the tatami near the kitchen doorway, watching her grandmother perform this small ceremony with an attention that seemed to ask nothing from the world in return. There was something serious about it, she would later recall, without being solemn, the way her grandmother moved slowly, deliberately, as though each small motion had been considered and agreed upon a very long time ago, and needed only to be repeated. The grandmother had come through years that were not easy, years the family never discussed directly, but which lived in the quiet economy of her gestures, the way she folded cloth with great care, the way she never wasted the last drops of anything, the way she paused before beginning a task as though offering it a moment of attention first. She had grown up in a city that knew fire, in years that no one in Japan speaks of easily, and she had built the long middle portion of her life with the particular patience of someone who understands, deeply and without bitterness, what it means to lose things and then, quietly, begin again. The tea at 3 was, her granddaughter now believes, something she gave to herself, a small appointment with stillness in whatever the day had carried, a daily signal that this particular hour belonged, at least, to her. Half a century of it, more or less, is what the family reckons, through the post-war years and the long rebuilding, through the raising of children in that house, through the slow quieting of rooms as those children grew and married and moved away, and the afternoons grew larger around her. And still, each day at 3, she made the tea. The granddaughter was perhaps 8 or 9 the first time she noticed the promise, though promise might be too strong a word for something said so gently, so many times, that it had become part of the texture of those summer afternoons, woven into them the way the smell of tatami is woven into an old house. Her grandmother would pour a small cup for the girl, and they would sit together in the kitchen's afternoon quiet, and her grandmother would speak in the soft, musical cadences of the Osaka dialect of the future, the way grandmothers do, as though they can see a little further along the road than the rest of us. She would say that when the girl grew up and married, she would make her tea on that day. She would make sure of it. She had decided this already. It was said the way grandmothers say such things warmly, repeatedly, without urgency, as though it were not a wish so much as a simple fact about the future that had already been agreed upon somewhere beyond the present moment. The girl grew older, and the summers in Osaka came less often, and the visits grew shorter as the years filled with school and friends and the gradually accelerating business of growing up, but the promise was always there when she arrived, folded into the afternoon tea the way the grandmother folded everything she valued, with care, without ceremony. She would pour, and she would speak of the wedding day tea, and the girl would nod, and outside the window the light would shift, and the city would murmur its ordinary murmur, and the afternoon would pass in the gentle, unremarkable way of afternoons that are later remembered as precious. When the grandmother became ill, it happened the way such things often do, slowly, over a season or two, a tiredness first, then a quieting of movement, then a stillness that was not the same as the stillness she had always carried within her. She continued making her tea as long as she was able in the hospital, with a small thermos the family brought, the familiar ritual performed in a smaller space, the teapot left at home on its shelf in the kitchen, waiting with the patience of objects that have nowhere else to be. She died in autumn, in the season that, to those who loved her, felt the most appropriate, the season of beautiful, unhurried endings, of things turning gold and releasing gently into the air. The family gathered around her in the ordinary way of families who have lost someone they had long known would be irreplaceable, and they carried the grief the way such grief is carried together, and slowly, and with the deep fatigue of those who have been watching and waiting and loving without being able to do enough. 3 years passed. In the Japanese tradition, the third anniversary of a death, the Sankaiki, is a moment of formal gathering, a memorial occasion when the family comes together once more to burn incense and offer prayers and sit with the particular quality of grief that has had time, now, to soften at its edges, to become something more like memory than wound. They came back to the house in Osaka, the grandmother's house, which had passed to the granddaughter's parents in the quiet way that houses pass, and they performed the ceremony in the sitting room with the care it deserved, the incense rising in thin, wavering threads toward the ceiling, the photographs of the grandmother looking out from the small altar with the particular stillness of the beloved dead. Afterward, as the afternoon settled around them and the formality of the ceremony released its hold, one of the adults noted the time. It was nearly 3 o'clock. It was the granddaughter's mother who mentioned, softly, that perhaps they should have tea, that Obachan would have wanted this, that the afternoon felt incomplete without it. Agreement moved through the room the way agreement does in families, not spoken aloud so much as understood, a collective leaning in the same direction, and then the small sound of someone rising to go to the kitchen. The teapot was where it had always been, on the low shelf beside the window, in the same position it had occupied through all the years, waiting in the patient way of objects that have no ambitions of their own and ask only to be used by those who know how. The granddaughter's mother washed it carefully, the way you wash something that has belonged to someone else even when that someone is gone, and she measured the leaves with the bamboo spoon that was still in its place, the small tin of tea still exactly where the grandmother had kept it. She poured the hot water in a slow circle, the way the grandmother had done, the way she had watched so many times, and she set the lid in place and waited, and then she lifted the pot and tilted it slowly over the first cup. Nothing came. Not a drop, not a slow trickle, not even the particular sound of liquid approaching a spout. The pot was full, the lid lifted, the leaves clearly visible, the water still steaming gently inside, and yet when it was tilted, nothing moved through the spout at all. The mother set it down, puzzled in the quiet way of someone encountering the unexpected in an otherwise ordinary moment, and the father took it gently and tried tilting it more carefully, then more firmly, checking the lid, checking the angle. Still nothing came. The younger aunt was called from the sitting room, and she took the teapot in both hands with the matter-of-fact air of someone who trusts practical solutions over private bewilderment, and she tilted it with confidence, and then waited, and then tilted it further still. A bamboo skewer was found in a kitchen drawer and someone threaded it gently through the spout, testing for any obstruction, but the passage was open, clear, unblocked. 3 adults stood in the kitchen of the grandmother's house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 3rd anniversary of her death, and not one of them could persuade the tea to pour. The granddaughter was their middle school age by then, old enough to feel the particular weight that had settled into the kitchen air, and she asked, carefully, whether she might try. Her mother handed her the pot. She held it the way she had watched her grandmother hold it, both hands, unhurried, the right guiding the spout toward the cup, the left steadying the lid, and she tilted it slowly, the way a person tilts something old and valued. The tea poured. A clean, even stream of pale green, exactly as it had always flowed, as though nothing had been unusual, as though the pot had simply been resting and was now, with these particular hands around it, ready. The kitchen was very quiet. She would remember, for many years afterward, the way her mother and her father and her aunt all looked at one another, slowly, and then looked at her, without finding anything to say. It was her mother who finally spoke softly, after a long moment, in the careful way of someone releasing a thought they have been holding at a slight distance. She recalled, almost to herself, what the grandmother had always told the girl, the promise that had been made and remade across so many summer afternoons, the wedding day tea, the certainty her grandmother had offered without anyone asking. The 3 adults stood in the small kitchen with their cups growing cool in their hands, and the afternoon light came through the window at the angle it always came at 3 o'clock, and outside, the city of Osaka carried on with its ordinary autumn business, entirely unaware of what had just occurred in this small room. They carried their cups to the sitting room and drank the tea on the tatami where the ceremony had been held, and they spoke of the grandmother in the warm, slightly tired way of people who have passed through the sharp part of grief and arrived, at last, in the quieter country that lies beyond. The teapot was washed and dried and returned to its shelf by the window, where it had always been. No one tried to pour from it again that day. The years moved in the way years do, with the steady, unhurried persistence of seasons turning in a place you know well, the familiar landmarks passing in their familiar order, each year slightly different in its particulars and deeply similar in its shape. The granddaughter finished school, and then the years of university, and then she entered the particular life of a young woman making her way in a Japanese city, the work that filled the weekdays, the small apartment in a neighborhood she gradually came to know, the careful accumulation of a life built quietly, piece by piece, in the way lives are actually built. She thought of the teapot sometimes, in the way you think of things that have not fully settled, not often, and not with any urgency, but with the quiet, involuntary return of something that has remained, simply, unanswered, waiting alongside everything else. She thought of her grandmother's hands on the clay, small and sure, and the particular hollow sound the pot made when it was set down on the wooden tray, a soft knock, low and complete, that had always seemed to her to signal something finished and good. And she thought of the promise repeated so many times across so many summer afternoons, which had once felt like warmth freely offered, and which had become, since the afternoon of the Sankaiki, something she could not quite name, not a mystery exactly, but a question held gently, without urgency. The way you hold a thing you have not yet found the right shelf for. She fell into love in the slow, reliable way, a growing understanding rather than a sudden revelation, the recognition of someone whose way of moving through the world fit comfortably alongside her own, like two people who have always walked at the same pace without having arranged to. They were together for several years before the question of marriage settled between them naturally, the way a conversation arrives at the thing it has been approaching all along, and when it did, it came without drama, a quiet decision made in a quiet kitchen, as the most important decisions so often are. She was 30 when they began to plan the wedding, something modest, as she had always imagined it, something that would feel like themselves rather than like a performance staged for others to admire. The date was chosen for 6 months ahead. It was her mother who mentioned the teapot. She called one evening in the ordinary way mothers call, to ask about the planning, to offer gentle opinions about venues and flowers and the quiet diplomacy of coordinating relatives, and then, near the end of the conversation, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the kitchen shelf. The teapot was still there, she said softly, still on the shelf beside the window, still in exactly the same place it had always been, waiting in the same patient way. She wondered aloud, in the careful tone of someone who has been turning a thought over for quite some time, whether they might try the pot again on the wedding day, the way Obachan had always spoken of it, the way she had promised, so many times, across so many summer afternoons. The granddaughter was quiet for a moment, listening to the small, familiar sounds of her mother's kitchen coming softly through the phone. Then she said yes, slowly, warmly, that she thought she would like that very much. The teapot sits tonight on its shelf by the window in the kitchen of the Osaka house, in the same position it has held for more decades than anyone currently living has counted precisely. It is a plain and modest thing, the color of old bark, worn smooth at the handle, the lid fitting with the quiet certainty of something that has been opened and closed 10,000 times and knows exactly where it belongs. From the outside, it does not look like a vessel of anything unusual. But there it sits, waiting in the patient way of old objects in old houses, through the cold months, through the rains of early summer, through the long warmth of August and the golden turning of autumn, through the ordinary weeks that accumulate in a house over time until they become the house itself. 6 months, and a wedding day, and the afternoon light at 3 o'clock. Perhaps there will be a clear explanation for what happened that afternoon at the Sankaiki, some quality of old clay, some way the tea leaves had settled, some combination of temperature and angle that 3 careful adults had not happened upon but a middle school girl had. Such things can often be understood with enough patience and the right questions. But perhaps the explanation is not the most important part of what this story contains. Perhaps the most important part is simply the grandmother herself, her 50 years of quiet ritual, her careful attention to small and ordinary things, the words she offered so many times across so many summer afternoons that they became, without anyone quite intending it, a kind of promise made to the future. She poured tea for everyone she loved, every afternoon, for half a century. That much is simply true. And the granddaughter, now a woman of 30, with a wedding 6 months away and a life assembled with great care, carries that truth with her the way you carry things given to you before you were old enough to understand their full weight. She carries the memory of those summer afternoons on the tatami, and the pale green color of the tea in the late afternoon light, and the soft, settled sound of the kettle low on the stove. She carries her grandmother's voice in the Osaka accent, speaking of a wedding day as though it were already settled, already seen from somewhere further along the road. And she carries the afternoon of the sankaiki, the kitchen quiet around them, the three adults looking at one another, the tea flowing so easily and simply from the pot when her hands were the ones holding it, as though it had been waiting for exactly that. In the older traditions of Japan, there is a feeling, not quite a doctrine, not quite a superstition, but something softer and more persistent than either, that the love of a person who is gone does not simply end when the person does, but continues in the world in the small, available ways that love finds when it can no longer move through a living body. It finds the objects a person touched with care, the rooms where they spent their hours, the habits and rituals that gave the ordinary days their shape. There is warmth in this feeling, and comfort, and it asks nothing of you, not belief, not disbelief, only a willingness to sit quietly alongside it for a moment, the way you sit alongside a thing that cannot be argued with and does not need to be. Whatever the teapot holds or does not hold, whatever the wedding day will or will not show, the granddaughter has come to feel that the story itself is a kind of gift, a thread connecting her to a woman who decided, somewhere in those long summer afternoons, that she would find a way to be present for this. There is a particular quality to a promise that is kept by being repeated, not once, in a formal moment, but many times, gently, in ordinary light, until it becomes simply a fact about the world that someone who loves you has decided is true. Her grandmother decided, in the quiet certainty that was her way, that the wedding day will arrive in 6 months, the way such days arrive, carrying with them a particular quality of time, slowed and noticed, each moment a little more visible than ordinary moments tend to be. And at some point in that afternoon, perhaps when the light turns at its familiar angle, the teapot will be taken down from its shelf and carried gently to the table. The leaves will be measured with the small bamboo spoon, and the water brought to the right warmth, and the lid set in place, and the pot held over a cup by hands that understand the weight and the meaning of what they are holding. And they will see what they will see. Whatever happens, the tea will be shared in the company of people who loved the grandmother and who love the granddaughter, in a house that carries the memory of 50 years of 3 o'clock. Whatever the pot does or does not do, the act of trying will itself be a form of remembering, which may be, in the end, what the grandmother intended all along, in all those gentle repetitions of a promise she could not know she would not be alive to keep in the ordinary way. A woman who lived with care and loved without ceremony, who found in a small daily ritual the quiet center of her days, and who sent that ritual forward into the future like a note placed in the hollow of a tree, meant for someone who would come later and know it was left for them. Somewhere in Osaka tonight, in a kitchen that holds the faint, layered scent of tea and old wood and years, A small clay teapot rests on a shelf beside a window. The light will come through again tomorrow at 3 o'clock, the way it has always come, turning the walls a warmer shade and settling across the familiar surfaces of the room with the unhurried ease of light that knows exactly where it belongs. The street outside will murmur at its customary distance, and the house will hold its quiet, and the shelf will hold its patient, ordinary cargo. 6 months from now, someone who was once a little girl on a tatami watching her grandmother pour tea in the late afternoon will hold that same pot over a cup and discover what love looks like when it has learned to travel through time. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in the warmth of that kitchen, in the weight of what is carried forward, in the love that continues to move through the world in whatever forms are still available to it. And so, we have come to the end of tonight's stories. All the voices have grown quiet now. The rooms they lived in have gone still. What was shared here, the small moments, the hidden feelings, the quiet weight of ordinary lives, drifts softly into the dark, like smoke from a lamp that has finally been put out.